This video was made possible by Squarespace, the best website creation tool in the entire universe. Far Cry. What kind of subhuman likes Far Cry? They're smelly open-world games made by smelly Ubisoft for low IQ individuals. They're literally the embodiment of everything wrong with the games industry. That about sums up the warmth towards Far Cry in 2022. And I've played Far Cry 6, so I don't entirely disagree. But hatred of the franchise, or of what it now represents, has become so normal that many have begun to forget the long and tragic distance it has fallen. We critique Far Cry 6 as if its failures were par for the course, or the specific symptom of repetition, and not a result of uniquely flawed design. But once, this franchise was widely adored and critically acclaimed. Once, it was known for its strengths, not for being, and I quote, Ubi trash. Once, Far Cry 3 was hailed as a masterpiece, and I don't entirely disagree with that either. After years of innovation on the Far Cry idea, an action survival game with a psychological slant whose core fantasy was to be cast into a hostile wilderness, and after years of innovative classics, all in some way marred by controversial design choices, it was 2012's Game of the Year, Far Cry 3, that seemed to basically nail it. Its principal brilliance was the way it handled change, like power progression, systems for which were stuffed into everywhere they'd fit, be it clearing outposts, climbing radio towers, or working for one of Rook Island's many lunatics. Everything counted, and through the significant reward of skills, money, guns, or unlocks, every step further was tangible. But here's the trick. It didn't just change what you could buy or who you could fight. In careful cooperation with balance, Far Cry 3's progression made fundamental changes to your behavior. Limited money and limited holsters at first promoted the characteristics of a scavenger. Weapons worth using were as often on the ground as they were in stores, and the conservation of ammo was a serious pressure. But with health, capacities, and unlocks, you could start to fight with what and how you wanted. Scavenging was forgotten as your loadout became customized and ideal. You were more than a survivor now, something worse, and you felt like it. Similar balancing influenced how skittish or confrontational your attitude towards conflict, and which of your self-preservation instinct or your bloodlust would prevail. This behavioral progression achieved far more than making every step forward all the more tangible and thus all the more satisfying. It had, in essence, created a mechanical character arc, which formed the basis of Far Cry 3's numerous ludonarrative strengths. Its fantasy, for instance, now more powerful than ever, and its story, whose central character arc was exactly that of the player. So as you became a predator, Jason Brody became a monster, and a reflection of his nemesis, the psycho pirate Vaas. In this way, Far Cry 3 was able to achieve its psychological slant, make the protagonist's capacity for violence a believable characteristic, make his change that much more convincing, and send a message about video games. Look at the insanity of systems designed for fun. Look at the monster you have become. It was a brilliance that rested on an otherwise solid foundation of good shooting, decent driving, pretty vistas, and the creative artistic character we'd come to expect from Far Cry, with common themes in imagery, sound, music, and even the UI, amounting to a thick atmosphere of sweat, madness, and dark emotion. Far Cry 3 was remarkable, and everyone then wondered, what would Ubisoft do with Far Cry next? Far Cry 3. They would do Far Cry 3 next, according to the onlooker, who saw in Far Cry 4's trailers and gameplay the same guns, the same cars, the same systems, and the same formula altogether. Far Cry 4 was something new, in that it was a Far Cry that wasn't, and that would have stunk no matter the year. But this was Ubisoft's 2014. Assassin's Creed Unity was the week before. Watch Dogs, still just 5 months. There would be no forgiveness. Everyone seems to like Far Cry 4. Everyone admits it. But even now, a clear resentment lingers, perhaps because, in the public mind, it sent the franchise on the path to where it is now. Repetitive, bastardized Ubi trash. I don't entirely disagree with that, but like Watch Dogs and Unity, Far Cry 4 does not deserve to be overshadowed by its stain. In many ways, it's worse than 3, but in many ways, it's better, and yet it received not a fraction of the acclaim. From the beginning to the end, sometimes loosely, sometimes closely, we're going to follow RJ's journey to find out which is which and why. Let's begin. Take me to Lakshmana. Lakshmana is a person, but Ubisoft's subtlest trick is to have the word fade out last, as if it were a title card, communicating RJ's assumption that Lakshmana is a place, and that's where we're going. Tension is the aim of what comes next, and in its every detail that tension is built, beginning with a recollection of RJ's travel advice not to come here. Kyrat is a dangerous place. A friend slips a 50 into your passport. The guards need to be bribed? That's not good. Let him do the talking? Why? The other faces on board are hidden in shadow. Then the talking begins and we don't understand a word of it. Why aren't they checking the passports? A helicopter emerges from the distance. It unsettles them. Something's off. And the tension escalates into a gunfight, with you trapped in a dark metal tube, barely escaping a bullet, but feeling every impact of the thundering sound. You fall at the heel of a border guard, but before the chopper touches down, he warns his friend, "We ought to be scared." And all that fear is built up for a single purpose, for Pagan Min to tear it down. The last person you expect to emerge from that helicopter is a walking question mark, much less a warm welcome, as if we and him were family. He's cleared his calendar for us? Eh? We're gonna tear shit up? Alright. Not even Troy Baker can save the suddenly killing your own henchman in a fit of manic rage routine from having its impact buried under the cringe of repetition. But apart from that, everything in this cutscene works. The smooth exposition, the realization of its characters, the legitimacy of our tension, and the surprise of our subversion. This was unique for Far Cry. You didn't see this coming, so now it's got you hooked. The bag comes off at Pagan's dinner table. We're smoothly introduced to Pagan's second general, Paul de Pleur, and the reason for our strangely warm reception. Pagan knew your mother, Ishwari Gale. He loved her, back when she was alive, and when he still had a reason to be.
Your mother, she never spoke of me, never mentioned me. No, we'll change all that. Paul, I need cash.
How much do you need?
All of it. Thank you. Here we go. All right. With this, with a smile.
That's you.
That's me. Although I'm not so sure anymore.
Then, reminiscing of Ishwari with a mix of longing and regret, the core characterization of the scene is that the prime of Pagan's life is past, and now he lives in its long, empty shadow, as a remnant of himself, an afterimage. It's a fascinating characterization. It's important too, but of course, that's not what Pagan's known for. Pagan's known for pulling off a pink suit, or more accurately, for being the one man alive cool enough to do that. Pagan's known for stealing your girl and the scene. He's known, like Vaas, as one of gaming's best villains, and with only 15 minutes of screen time. How? What's immediately critical is Pagan's unpredictability. He knows things we don't, wants things we don't understand, and he is just as willing to kill someone as he is to talk. It lends both a tension and an intrigue to his presence. Much of it arises from his unique characterization as a civilized psychopath. He might be a murderer, but at least he isn't rude. The charismatic dimension of this persona is in the rare simultaneity of the psychopath's complete confidence with the civilized man's complete refinement, where each extreme cancels out the least attractive aspects of the other. Absolute confidence means politeness refines but doesn't repress, allowing Pagan to do whatever he wants and express his every emotion in the details of gesture and voice. But refinement means that confidence is never ugly or embarrassing. It's stylized and crafted, portraying an effortless control of the total self, and thus an enthralling charisma.
Who is this? Is this your +1? Strong, silent type. I like it.
It is frustrating that we'll never really know how Troy Baker executed so convincing and compelling a balance of these often conflicting extremes of personality, or if Pagan Min would have worked at all without his performance. Who could dissect so human an art as voice acting, or so great a talent as his? What I know for sure is that Baker makes silk of every syllable, enlivens every line with further stylistic and emotional detail, and that he does it without once stumbling into a vocal cliché. The performance is very much his own, which lends significant credence to Pagan's authenticity.
From your diaphragm! Shh, 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 shh. Now we listen.
Nothing. I'm afraid they're not coming for you, buddy.
Though second, of course, to the performance, it would be criminal to overlook the mishmash of characteristics that amount to his identity. Pagan is Asian, British, and partially American. His suit is pink, his hair is white, his trim is weird, and his name is Pagan Min. These things are not disconnected, but they are unusually combined, which serves to suppress group identity and bring out Pagan's individuality, this way enhancing his presence on screen. Nothing special happens in this cutscene. It's the familiar intro itinerary of exposition and assorted bad guy stuff, but you're transfixed as if you'd never watched a scene like it, because Pagan Min is a Schedule 1 drug. I'm afraid to say that when he leaves to deal with a threat, so does this introduction's strength. Against Pagan's wishes to stay put and enjoy the crab rangoon, we stumble into a rescue attempt from the Golden Path, the rebel militia founded by your father, Mohan Ghale. They heard you were sitting around talking to the villain like a fucking liberal snowflake, so they have come with guns, cars, and explosions to remind you that this is an action game. What follows is not a bad series of encounters, but it's really not very good either. Far Cry 3 and 5 carefully crafted the impression that you were in one long, desperate escape from the villain's stronghold to some unknown place of safety. Though Far Cry 3 uses a fall to load you into an entirely new zone, and Far Cry 5 guides the player to where they need to be, the impression is that you had just ran off into the wilderness, and through that, the chase felt real. Far Cry 4 does not create that impression. Far Cry 4 fucking sits on it, bothering with no disguise for the fact that the valley you've fallen into is completely disconnected from where you were, from the rest of Kyrat, or that it exists for the sole purpose of delivering tutorial encounters. It looks like what it is. Bait, swimming, stealth, and combat are conveniently organized in a walled-in sequence that resembles a design training course. The idea of a connected pursuit is completely unconvincing, and as a result, the tension is lost. But the problems with the intro's second half run far deeper than level design. Kinda don't want to be rescued. Pagan's interesting, he's strange, unpredictable, and according to that nature, he has driven the story in an unpredictable direction. Sabal is not strange, he's very predictable, and he is pulling you into the same story you've heard 1,000 times before. Ugh, do we have to? Part of the problem is that after subverting Pagan's villainhood, the game never truly unsubverted it. Yes, he forked our pan and penned that man. He's clearly a few sexes short of a Ubisoft meeting, but unlike Vars and Joseph, he doesn't want RJ harmed. On a personal level, he's not done much villaining, and the reason why is known. He loved Ishwari, and there's a non-zero chance he's our real father. This is critical, because it doesn't just mean we lack reason to fight him, it also means that cooperating with Pagan is obviously RJ's best bet at achieving his goals, to find Lakshmana and to spread Ishwari's ashes. We just put 1,000 miles between him and us. Were we rescued, or were we kidnapped by the game when it remembered it had to find a way to justify its conflict? Amita and Sabal, leaders of the Golden Path, are now left with the immensely difficult task of arguing that to stay and fight for them really is the better, safer, and smarter thing. But that task is soon made impossible when Pagan establishes contact with RJ over the radio. Now, your physical distance is non-preventative. Now, the alternative to fighting an entire fucking country is literally a phone call away. So no, Sabal trying to sway you with notions of duty and honor is not the least bit convincing, nor is their appeal to the wishes of Ishwari and Mohan. RJ's choice to stay simply does not work. The introduction is beautiful, and for a time, gripping, but it fails in the two ways no introduction can fail. It doesn't justify the game, and it doesn't compel you through it. Far Cry 4 begins with a sore lack of narrative momentum. But hey, if we're staying, we might as well make the most of it. From the wrong angle, Kyrat looks like the midpoint between the confidently 8th gen fidelity of Far Cry 5 and the 7th gen flatness of Far Cry 3. Stretched rock textures on hillsides and their drab skin of unnaturally uniform grass plague most of Kyrat's south. There are too few tree models, night is too bright, and you do feel the absence of weather. But the right angle is never more than a glance away. A beaming sun, glistening white, over the teeth of gods, and beneath them, an elaborate sprawl of cliffs, valleys, rivers, and towers. The right angle is wherever you can see Kyrat's art direction. And it's not always the vista. Kyrat is a country, its culture is its heart. The vibrant colors of powder, the carvings, the paintings, the statues and murals, the soft ringing of bells, the prayer flags and prayer wheels, and that ever-present religious hum. Kyrat is genuinely enchanting. I'd take it over Hope and Yara in a heartbeat, and it's tough to say which of the art team or the real place deserves more of the credit. But being set here, of all places, does come with a second advantage, because nothing else is set here. India, Nepal, Tibet. Kyrat is made from their myriad beauties, and in this way, it is unique, original for games, and so capable of dazzling and fascinating in a way the familiar worlds of the West or Japan would struggle to, and of producing a strong sense of seclusion that only the unfamiliar setting could achieve. With its wallpaper hill textures and washed-out greens, Kyrat still makes the modern game blush, because there is literally nowhere else like it. I will never get bored of looking at this game. According to popular belief, gameplay is where Far Cry 4's originality ends. There's no Kyrat of mechanics or pagan-esque system. There is just Far Cry 3. Well, they're not entirely wrong. We're still sneaking with the same simple detection systems, disabling alarms and fighting reinforcements in outposts. We're still driving with the same accessible handling and flying with the same gliders. We're still drawing back the same orgasmic bow and shooting it at prey to craft upgrades for our carrying capacities, leveling up to buy new abilities, spending cash to restock ammo, and saving it up to buy new guns, which still look and sound slick. We've still got love for the streets reppin' 213, and Far Cry still promotes aggressive play whilst creating a predatorial fantasy in exactly the same ways. They first incentivize getting close with poor weapon accuracy at mid to long range, the devastating power of explosive weapons, many of which must be thrown by hand, and the instant kill melee takedowns, which can only be used in melee range. Then they force frequent repositioning with berserker enemy types, defender enemy types, and enemy grenades, which they always throw accurately. The fight is given a persistent momentum, an energy, and it is usually a motion towards the danger. But in case you hadn't noticed, Far Cry 3 and 4 do not play like Doom Eternal. The reason for that is their health system, which makes healing an extensive and inconvenient process. It can take up to 15 seconds of vulnerable animation to make a full recovery. By severely punishing damage this way, Ubisoft harshly discourage exposing yourself to its source, enemy fire. And because enemies in Far Cry are relentlessly accurate at all ranges and even while you're sprinting, the player's aggression becomes reliant on the protection of the level itself. You flank, stalk, and chase from above. You make quick, pounce-like bursts of aggression before slipping back into cover with equal haste. It's the tiger's fantasy, and it wouldn't be if any one cog in this clockwork were different, if healing was easy, if enemies weren't so accurate, or if there were an easier way to avoid damage. So yes, in that sense, Far Cry 4 is very much like Far Cry 3. They're both deceptively elegant and highly competent systems. Well, they are when they work, because we've also got Far Cry 3's clumsy design flaws to contend with, and that speaks to a carelessness that is much harder to forgive. In life, when you unexpectedly ignite, instinct compels you to put it out as soon as possible. In Far Cry, however, you need to wait to have caught enough fire for a specific put-out prompt to appear. During this wait, you're taking damage, due to being on fire. If you attempt to heal early, it will be cancelled when the heal function is eventually replaced by the put-out function. And so fire is frustratingly punishing, not because it's too powerful, but because its botched implementation forces you to burn. RJ, meanwhile, continues to repeatedly bounce off window frames before you hit the finicky angle right and he folds his wooden ass through. But the major problem with movement is the total absence of any logical consistency for what can and cannot be climbed. Only the middle section of this wall in Utkarsh is climbable, not the shorter part, or the taller part, or anywhere else in the village. Bafflingly, it's altogether more likely that you'll be able to climb a ledge of head height or taller than a ledge of waist height or a ledge of chest height, which are almost always insurmountable. What it truly depends on is Ubisoft's arbitrary designations, which is what you will depend on in the midst of encounters. It's still one of the worst implementations of advanced movement in modern FPS. For better or for worse, Far Cry 3 and 4 do share a common core. It was not a myth, but that does not mean they're the same game. Think of that core as a potato. In this genius metaphor, Far Cry 3 and 4 are like different types of crisp, where balance, level design, and distribution are the cook, shape, and flavoring. They can completely alter the experience of that very same potato. Far Cry 4 is a case study in what's possible with reconfiguration. So what's next is for us to bring our focus to certain types of activity, to see both how this works and the difference it amounts to. Far Cry 4 turns up the heat. You're stronger than Jason, not because you have any more health, but because of the weapons you've got stuffed down your pants. There are not just more to choose from, they are also easier to get. Guns aren't so expensive, holsters aren't so tough to craft. C4, grenades, proximity mines, arrows, explosive arrows, and shit implementation arrows are cheap, abundant, and quickly restocked from vendors. Far Cry 4 also introduces a consumable supply of silent one-shot throwing knives and throwable bait for attracting angry distractions. Oh, you're still a glass cannon, you've just got a much bigger cannon. And in response to this strength, Kyrat toughens up accordingly. Outposts are larger, equipped with more alarms, more enemies, and often with turrets or mortars. The challenge balances out. But what's simply better than Far Cry 3 is Kyrat's more intricate level design. Everything is more complex on all dimensions, with denser and different combinations of routes, heights, sightlines, and buildings. The decisions you make in consideration of these factors, what exposure is to take, which way to go, are constant and never reach a dead end, where the best choice is to stop and do nothing for too long a time. More complexity is not always better, but it was better from Far Cry 3 to 4. We're off to a good start. But to understand stealth or outposts any further, we'll need to approach them from the outside, where we're immediately confronted by a number of minor mistakes. The first thing you'll see is yet another problem Far Cry 4 inherits. I'm not racist, but Koret's southern outposts kind of all look the same. Corrugated metal roofs, brown shacks, white paint, a large building in the center. I've played this game a lot, and I can't recall the details of most of Koret's outposts. Now the second thing you'll see will probably be the title card, and that's a problem for Invented all by itself. They're really pretty. They're also your worst fucking enemy, occluding crosshairs, the minimap and detection gauges in the critical moments of your approach. It's always frustrating to be blinded this way, but it's so absurd that it's usually funny too, defeated by a fucking title card. The most important thing you'll see, however, is much simpler. More of everything you want to see, because Far Cry 3's outposts were surrounded by opaque walls, but in Far Cry 4, only a few of them are, and partially. Enemies, turrets, cages, barrels, alarms, and vehicles are all exposed to a distant view. At the same time, easily accessible natural perch points directly overlook almost every outpost in the game. From here, you can scan most of it in a single sweep of the camera, and you can insert where you please by simply diving off it with a wingsuit. In these two ways, Far Cry 4 has made scouting quicker and easier than ever, and the average encounter is now likely to begin with an accurate knowledge of what's inside the arena. The immediate advantage is simple. There's less scouting. Good. Fuck scouting. Scouting is entirely shallow, and because most outposts share a similar structure, it's also highly repetitive. Cutting it down only serves to improve the stealth process. But there is a further and much larger impact of having reliably increased awareness, and not having imprisoning walls. With predictability in hand, and all dangers foreseen, and the ability to navigate in and out freely, you gain a far greater ability to design and execute long-term plans. In Far Cry 3, for example, when you slip through a gap in the wall, your entrapment, combined with your lesser knowledge, gave rise to tenser, reactive play, divided into smaller steps of progress. Play was more improvisational. But in Far Cry 4, I know where the problems are. I also know what problem I want to deal with first, and because of my freedom, I can reliably get there. I'm optimizing. I have created a plan. Play is much more intentional. The inevitable effect at first is that there's less tension, less unpredictability, and because of that, less excitement. But ideally, that loss would be worth what we gain. More awareness should mean a greater ability to make complex plays, and so the greater involvement of Far Cry's immense sandbox. It should. But it doesn't. In fact, it does the opposite, discouraging the use of all but the simplest tactics. And the reason why comes down to balance. Outside of sneaking, stabbing, and shooting with a bow, nearly everything you can do, including everything that would constitute a complex play or a sandbox option, is loud. Fire, animals, mines, or rolling vehicles will be noticed, cause a major disturbance, and place the guards on high alert. This is always a serious disadvantage for the player, but there are other values to a disturbance that change dramatically from Far Cry 3 to Far Cry 4. In Far Cry 3, shaking up enemy positions could reveal what before was hidden. If I want to slip through a gap that before I couldn't, a disturbance could create that opportunity. That's valuable. And in Far Cry 4, there's no walls, you have almost total awareness, and chances are you're standing on a dive board. You don't need any help getting in, and there's probably not much more to learn. At the same time, our greatest advantage in Koret is the predictability that allows for long-term plans. And what happens to predictability when you introduce chaos? It disintegrates like fucking Prince Andrew's cover story. Our great advantage is lost, so we've got a far greater incentive not to make a noise. And because everything interesting does make a noise, we've got a far greater incentive not to do anything interesting. Intentional play has given us nothing in return for what it took, because there is nothing worth intending to do. And that doesn't make stealth boring, just bland. And I don't think Koret's superior level design makes up for the loss. But here's what's truly remarkable. This is a total anomaly. It's the exception to the trend, because for every other system and every other mechanic, the tendency is reversed. Far Cry 4's sandbox is prioritized and emphasized, and what happens is the gameplay flourishes. It begins with balance. In combat, predictability was foregone the moment the first bullet was fired. You have little to lose and a lot to gain from using the sandbox, and the sandbox is everywhere. It's in your weapon wheel, the grenades, Molotovs, C4, mines, and arrows. It's in the arena itself, the mortars, turrets, animal cages, and vehicles, which can either be used as vehicles, as turrets in themselves, or as sources of explosions. It's also outside the arena. It's the nearby enemies, animals, or allies that may be attracted into the fight. It's Far Cry's excess of relevant possibility, its deep well of things that can happen and will happen that exceed those of the average shooter. This is what I am calling the sandbox, and it can be divided into two broad categories: what's predictable enough to be used by the player, and what's not. Usable options integrate with the combat depth nicely. They're made relevant by their high power, and they're balanced by two key factors. The first being that using them requires a touch of skill. It's a challenge to put mines in the best place, to account for both the travel time and the gravity of arrows, the immense travel time of mortars, and the vulnerable position you take on a turret. The second challenge is limitations. You've got 5 or perhaps 8 explosive arrows, and it's 2 to destroy a vehicle, so in addition to using them well, you must also use them sparingly. The same balance applies to mines and molotovs. There's never enough to make a hard encounter easy, and though there often is to make the average encounter easy, the limit that stops you is money. They're cheap, yes. They are not, however, free, and if you're abusing them, you'll run dry fast. These challenges are what turn the use of powerful options into interesting decisions. It is a significant success. Now, the unmanipulable sandbox is what can and will happen that you can't or won't cause. It's mostly driven by the AI, who critically are designed with just as much willingness to use sandbox options as you are. If they see an unmanned turret, they'll man it. If they see a driverless vehicle, they'll drive it. And by moving vehicles, they change the location of explosions and fire sources, which are themselves major components of the unmanipulable sandbox. Explosions make more explosions, fire makes more fire. Both have the potential to affect massive, but usually unforeseeable changes to the encounter. Then there are the enemies who throw fire, and all the enemies, allies, or animals outside the arena who could be attracted in, possibly bringing another vehicle with them. The result is the right amount of chaos, a cauldron of cause and effect, rarely so intense as to suffocate the player's agency, but reliably strong enough to massively reconfigure designed encounters, far beyond the dynamism of the average shooter, producing a further, deeper level of variation that can make a second or third or eighth attempt of the same fight feel as if you're playing it again for the first time, and that can even give the first time a degree of wildness and character that simply couldn't be scripted. It's fun then, it's fun when you try again after death, and it's still fun on the next playthrough. Which leads me onto an abrupt change of topic, because the most important thing there is to say about Far Cry 4's campaign is that it's overwhelmingly enjoyable because it's overwhelmingly composed of encounters that play to these strengths. Jalendu, the monastery, the sleeping giants, the brick factory, the poppy fields, the King's Bridge, both variations of the Utkarsh defense, and the Royal Palace. These make up most of the campaign, and beneath their distinct visual and geometric character, what's common is that they're basically just outposts, open to any approach, intricate and interesting level design, filled with turrets, weapons, mines, and vehicles. The sandbox is all accounted for. But of equal importance is that they also follow the outpost's objective structure. There is an initial assault, either from stealth or combat, and then waves of reinforcements thereafter, refueling Far Cry's dynamic fire with a fresh supply of vehicles and AI, and momentarily presenting a defense scenario, where special emphasis is placed on preparation with use of the usable sandbox. Your freedom is never smothered by needlessly pedantic fail states or needlessly pedantic success criteria. In this simple way, Far Cry 4's campaign is mostly good. But there is a second side to its success that is even simpler. It's rarely bad, by which I mean dull or shallow or frustrating missions are almost entirely absent. There's only one instant fail stealth mission. There are no mandatory tailing missions. No mission is stretched agonizingly thin like later Far Cry's, and at no point will you have to spend 5 minutes mindlessly following an NPC with nothing but brief pepperings of small, predictable combat to engage you. Also like later Far Cry's. This is the best campaign of the franchise, by quite a large margin, and it's good for shooters in general. Told you this would be abrupt. It's now time to expand our focus to what happens and what exists between the arenas, to Kyrat, its inhabitants, its gameplay loop, and its movement systems. The strength of Far Cry's movement was never its depth. Sure, there were some long-term pathfinding decisions to be made in the open world of Far Cry 3. Roads were windy, bendy, and importantly, indirect, which meant it was rarely clear if you were on the fastest road to your destination. And in Far Cry 3, you had no GPS to make it certain. You had a map and your judgment. There was a choice to be made. A difficult one? Not always. An interesting one? Not particularly. But it was something, and it helped put you in the shoes of an outsider. It helped fulfill the fantasy. It was also pretty much it. Far Cry's driving is simplified to the point you never need to do anything but push the stick in the desired direction, and its flying is a static, shallow, straight line from your position to your destination. Far Cry's strength is not depth. Far Cry's true strength is feel. It's the bounce of the suspension that reads the uneven ground like braille, the visual tactility of RJ's hands as he responds to your every input. It's the gorgeous reactive interiors and the depth of sound. It's the realization that makes Far Cry's cars engaging to drive, or at least it's that stops you from falling asleep at the wheel. Far Cry 4's grappling hook is a success for exactly the same reasons. You have 3 options: go up, go down, and jump, which is usually one option, because up is where you're going. Doesn't sound like a recipe for fun, but it is. The rope is physics-based, there's momentum and a believable swing, and there's the otherwise pointless jump button to help you play around with the swing. Your legs track to the wall with the same tactility as your hands on the wheel. It's playground fun. But here's the thing. Feel has limits. We acclimatize to purely sensory experience quickly, which is why 20 seconds of grappling is usually fun, and a minute of grappling is usually tedious. It's also why, despite how good driving felt, if it took longer than a couple of minutes, things inevitably grew dull. That is the problem Far Cry 4 seeks to fix. Karat's roads are still indirect, and between them are a jagged assortment of verticalities. Mountains, hills, cliffs, and valleys. It's a harsh world, but when it comes to navigation, that doesn't mean a harder time, because they're not obstacles. Take a steep hill, for instance. In Far Cry 3, you'd probably have to go around it. In Far Cry 4, there'll be a hook to grapple onto, or a grassy path shallow enough to climb on foot. Then take a deadly drop. In Far Cry 3, if you fell, you'd die. In Far Cry 4, you might not. Fall damage is more forgiving, and RJ Gale has a remarkable superpower. He can kind of skate down almost any drop. And so despite the harsh and deadly image Karat projects, it is in practice vastly more forgiving. Far Cry 4's mountains are less of an obstacle than Far Cry 3's hills, because the path up or down is always quickly accessible. So why should you care? You should care because in Far Cry 4 you get the wingsuit almost immediately, and when you can fly, a drop is actually an opportunity to travel faster than any car and to travel directly. The mountain isn't a roadblock, it might be a viable alternative to the road. It's a dive board that you can easily climb up to, which means taking the time to do so might be faster to your destination than staying in the car. The same is true for any cliff or even any hill. The depth doesn't change much. The choice of whether to keep driving or to abandon your car for some other method is interesting, but only when the answer isn't obvious, and that, once every few minutes, is not a revolution. What's important is that you're abandoning your car, because between drives is walking, flying, and grappling. There is a constant change, a constant cycle that is a constant refreshment to Far Cry's feel-driven movement loop. What can happen will happen. It prevents boredom not with more depth, but with a more exciting structure. And it is a patchwork solution, but the problem is solved, because Far Cry 3's movement got boring, and Far Cry 4's never really does. But Ubisoft are not done yet. They've got just a few more tricks to help push the ball into the net. Karat's verticality makes valleys a common feature of its environment. What does that mean? Well, more flight for one. They're free of obstacles, and they're always lower than their surroundings, which allows you to glide for the longest time. They also guarantee a soft landing, because valleys invite rivers, which in turn makes the transition from flights to boats regular. More flight and more sailing. The depth doesn't budge, but the variation takes a modest boost. Perhaps that was also the goal of Far Cry 4's rare new vehicle types. The hovercraft may just be a slippy car, but in life, sometimes a slippy car is all you need to have a good time. It's like Drift on Need for Speed, except you're racing rhinos instead of 12-year-olds. It's remarkably fun, and it's different, which bolsters our movement loop beautifully. Unfortunately, I cannot offer the gyrocopter similar praise. It's a helicopter. That's a first. It's also very rare, which is why it doesn't destroy the balance, but nevertheless I tend to avoid them when I see them, because, bringing me on to my last point, the gyrocopter is a victim to the movement's biggest flaw. Flight. It's shallow, which as we know is no death sentence, but flight also doesn't feel very good. Be it the gyrocopter, the wingsuit, or the hang glider, flight is static. It's a straight line from where you are to where you're pointed, with no challenge or character in the air to give you anything to do besides staring at the scenery. Now, at low altitudes, which is often in a world hilly enough to initiate flight from half the fucking roadside banks, this isn't much of a problem, because you don't need the air to have a personality when you're continually confronted by obstacles. Wrestling the wingsuit's slow turns to avoid trees, posts, and high terrain. And when you're asking, do I have the altitude to make it past that hill crest? Or do I pull my chute early to avoid the risk of death? Low altitude feels fine. Exceptionally, it is also challenging, and we have Karat's design to thank for its regularity in the movement loop. Things aren't so bad at the medium altitudes either. Most flights in Far Cry 4 last no longer than 30 seconds, which isn't quite enough time to get bored. 2 minutes, that's enough time to get bored. And though these lengthy, high-altitude flights are the rarest, they are nonetheless common in a game so given to flying. The gyrocopter is always a high-altitude flight. There are no obstacles and no time limits. It's fucking mind-numbing, just like planes and helicopters will go on to be in Far Cry 5 and Far Cry 6. It's also a small failure compared to Far Cry 4's success. This isn't a great movement system, but it also isn't boring. It's the best movement has ever been in this franchise. What's left then is for us to zoom out on Far Cry 4's gameplay as far as we can, and discuss the whole that movement is a part of, the open world gameplay loop. In Far Cry 3, the gameplay loop of Rook Island was rigidly sequential. You would travel to the next mission, fight the odd patrol, and you would clear any nearby outposts on the way. It worked just fine, but it did have problems. For one, it was repetitive, unchanging, unable to surprise you, and eventually unfit to interest you. Second, Far Cry 3's gameplay loop was self-defeating, because in committing the player to taking outposts, it so made reliable the clearing of random enemy spawns from the nearby area. As a representation of the difference your actions made, this was a good thing, but needlessly, it came at the cost of completely sterilizing the open world of gameplay. Driving back the way you came having beaten an outpost in Far Cry 3 was Rook Island at its worst, which in turn further incentivized going towards the next outpost and repeating the process, because that's where the gameplay was. These are the problems Far Cry 4 has addressed. To begin with, you can't clear enemy spawns anymore. Taking outposts will only reduce them, but you won't be reducing them too bad either, because you'll be taking fewer outposts. Rook had 34, Karat only has 24, and Karat is 50% larger. That means sparsity, which means you're less likely to run into one. Most outposts are also roadside, and as we've just learned, you're less likely than ever to be taking the roads. But perhaps most importantly is the narrative context. In Far Cry 3, outposts were framed as the might of this pirate infestation, and you were told it was vital to burn them down. In Far Cry 4, they're just outposts. Their importance is never so emphasized. It'd be weird to see an untouched map bleeding red by the endgame, but outposts feel firmly optional nevertheless. Enemy spawns then stay nice and high in the open world, which is a very good thing, because the open world is where Far Cry 4 has focused all its efforts. There is a new gameplay loop. I call it Murphy's Claw. What can happen will happen, and it will always be violent. Perhaps we ought to begin with the elephant in the room. There is more in Karat, and there is more you can do. Like riding elephants. You can charge, bash, shoot guns. It's really fucking fun. There are also rhinos, eagles, and honey badgers. Would you believe me if I told you they were just as dangerous? There are new vehicles too, and you can now shoot a sidearm whilst driving them. But what's important is everything that becomes possible as a result. Car chases, for the first time, a thing. Drive-bys too, as well as hijackings and all manner of improvisational plays. Those are the ingredients. Now let's find out how they all come together. In Karat, the Golden Path, the Royal Army, the wildlife, and you are at war. Their natural spawns are on-road, off-road, and extremely common. Oh, and they all fucking hate each other. Automatic, quickly acting hostility is the gravity that smashes one group into the other. Eagle to Muppet, red to blue, and red to you. A high population of hostiles and a connective force put together would create a persistent chaos of gameplay in Karat alone. But there are also a large number of random special events designed specifically to ignite, intensify, and vary conflict. Skirmish, animal attack, and outpost recapture parties pressure open combat. Kill all the enemies, try to save your allies. Hostages and priority lieutenants, meanwhile, begin quietly, and so put a much greater emphasis on stealth. Couriers, supply trucks, and convoys involve movement if you're giving chase, or preparation if you're lying in wait. There is also roadblock, animal cage, and more rarely, bomb defusal. Each one is interesting in itself, and each one acts as a magnet for combatants nearby. There are 11 things an event could be, but there are thousands of things an event could become. Karat's one true god is a random encounter generator with an extremely broad range, where what can happen will happen, and where what can happen is always fun. The integrity of all this dynamic chaos is maintained, that is, made as interesting as possible and never made uninteresting, by a number of balancing factors. The speed of trucks, for instance, is balanced just so that there's always a chase, but it's never belabored. The driver is always exposed, but it's a very tough shot. You can throw grenades, but you'll need the time and the skill to cook. You can get out and use a two-handed weapon, but that'll give them a head start, so you'll need to aim it well. Grenades and explosive arrows are the easiest explosives to use, but you'll need to hit a vehicle twice to destroy it. Mines and C4 are more powerful, but consumable, and require a much slower, riskier setup. In addition, enemy AI is still highly willing to populate nearby vehicles, and charging animals are given a fighting chance by the vulnerability of vehicles to being flipped over, and so rendered unusable. The final pillar of our new gameplay loop is critical: motive. Far Cry 4 has systematically removed every one of Far Cry 3's incentives to avoid an encounter instead of engage with it. It's added a few new incentives to engage as well. For one, they're called karma events, because getting involved isn't just the fun thing to do, it's the right thing to do. The more people you shoot, the more karma you are, and the better discounts you'll get at murder stores. Second is that the ability to shoot from inside a vehicle makes all conflict more accessible and more convenient. If I can get involved in a fight whilst traveling from a single click click of my mouse. I'm significantly more likely to than if I have to slow down, stop, and get out. Never underestimate how preventative a 5-second wait can be. Vehicles also provide a reliable escape from hairy situations, again removing reason to avoid such a situation outright. Third is the general matter of scarcity. RJ is richer than Jason, much richer, which makes ammo and weapons far more accessible, which in turn means conservation of ammo is not something he considers in combat. You have less to lose, and having more firepower at any one time makes it less likely he will lose. But the influence of scarcity on the player's attitude towards conflict has not disappeared. It has in fact reversed, because the price of crafting larger capacities is the still rare animal skins, and where better to find bears, tigers, or leopards than in the midst and aftermath of a battle. You will gain far more from scavenging than you ever will from intentional hunting. Karat shoots first and asks only one question. You're not a pussy, are you? Motive, integrity, possibility. These are the pillars of Far Cry's new gameplay loop, where you go to your next objective and shit happens on the way. It is always fun, and it's usually fresh. And not just on the first approach, but even on the way back. Anyway, always, even several playthroughs in, where it still has the potential to show you something interesting. The fixes to the problems with Far Cry 3 are among Far Cry 4's greatest qualities. Its gameplay is a victory. But there is one more thing to say. I wonder, how does all this make you feel? When I say Karat shoots first and asks only if you're a bitch-ass, pansy-ass, pussy-ass bitch, I imagine it's not quite the same way you felt of Far Cry 2 or 3. An element of the fantasy has been suppressed, the element of vulnerability. You do not feel small in Karat. You feel like the king Pagan wants you to be, because you are spontaneous and whimsical in the face of savage terrain, because you have an answer for everything in your weapon wheel, and you can see everything coming from the perches provided for you, but also because no resource is truly scarce, and so you have nothing to lose besides your health bar, and so you'll never need to scavenge or to make do with what you can find. Height isn't a threat. Encounters are invitations. The fantasy has changed. You are still a predator, but you're not much of a survivor. That side of Far Cry was smothered in 4, and in the 8 years since it has been nullified entirely. What survivor finds it easier to take his pelts from a war he single-handedly won than the animals he carefully hunted? Now, how you want Far Cry to make you feel is subjective. For some, no doubt, this is where Far Cry lost its identity, became another generic action shooter, and killed the franchise for good. For others, this is where the franchise got good. But there are some measurable side effects to Far Cry's great soul shift. Take the character of the Chaos, for instance. The last thing you could call Karat is dead, but it feels alive in a mechanical way, as if the force driving all this madness isn't a civil war, but an overexcited game engine. The conflict is constant and relentless. Enemies smash into one another with suicidal abandon. Animals are fucking super soldiers, with honey badgers swallowing entire magazines, rhinos swallowing several, and eagle claws packing the punch of a shotgun. It's like all of Karat is on cocaine. And it's good they pose a challenge, but the absurdity is undisguised. It's openly wearing clown shoes, and that can be a problem, because Far Cry is not just cause. It aims for a reasonable degree of believability intact. Bell towers are another issue. Creaking floors, howling wind, and a slightly turbulent camera do their best in tandem to create a sense of vertigo, but Karat's bell towers are spacious and exist in Far Cry 4, a video game where you have the parachute from the start and the wingsuit after the tutorial act, which means the worst that could happen if you fall is minor inconvenience. If you don't fear the falls, then height has no meaning, and the climb loses its thrill. Without that, all that's left is the platforming exercise, which is not a lot to be left to. Radio towers were far from riveting, but bell towers are usually boring. I think I'll leave this tower running. The following is an announcement from the Ministry of Public Affairs and Social Harmony. In light of the global recession, Pagan Min is pleased to announce a new source of national income. Web design. Let Squarespace's easy yet highly capable creation tools prove to you the truth in hours. A website is not an outdated tradition. These are lies, spread by the Golden Path. A website is a hub, simple, intuitive, and personalized, where everything you want or want others to see is only a click away. Your products can be sold in an integrated store. Your social media can be collated and organized. Your audience can be engaged with by blog, newsletter, and member-only chat rooms. Scheduling such posts for future release will be an especially useful feature if you write anything critical of Pagan Min. Use code Whitelight for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain, and may Pagan's light shine upon you all. Now, There is a final effect to Far Cry 4's new fantasy. It's a big one. You see, to be compatible with a relentless gameplay, Far Cry's typical outsider protagonist will need to become very competent and very willing to kill very quickly. That's not easy to justify, and Far Cry 4 just doesn't.
There's a gun underneath the dashboard. Use it.
It's got 1 foot in and 1 foot out the door, attempting both to address RJ as the foreigner who only came to spread his mother's ashes, who must be convinced to stay and fight for the Golden Path, but also to completely skip the part where his quickly acquired knack for slaughter is believable, justified, or even acknowledged. Not even by RJ himself. After rampages and suicide missions, after having felled half the regime, RJ continues to behave with exactly the same polite, calm, and reserved attitude he had before the first bullet was fired. He doesn't change in the slightest. It's weird. It's kind of creepy. And because the other parts of RJ's being a foreign tourist are directly addressed, it becomes impossible to suspend your disbelief for that one thing the game can't be bothered with. The dissonance is glaring, and it does considerable damage to your investment. RJ barely budges his lips when Banapur is attacked in retaliation for his rescue. You're gonna ask where Bardra is, RJ? Don't you two get along like a house on fire? Oh shit. Bardra! And yes, that was a transition into the story. They don't hand out silver play buttons for nothing.
I'm all right. The people need to see her. It'll comfort them.
She's just a child, Sabal, and she's terrified. I'll take her home, and then we'll worry about the people, okay? Thank you.
You're okay.
This is what we get for rescuing Ajay. We hit Paul's house, he slaughters a village.
This isn't on RJ, it's on me. We can't worry about that now. They took the outpost, and they have hostages.
Fine. The outpost first. Without it, we're cut off from the others.
Much of Far Cry 4's first act revolves around establishing the idea that choices have consequences. In this case, the consequences of rescuing you, but usually of the choices you make for the Golden Path, which is why it's also in these first missions that we learn who they are and so what those choices mean.
This is about lives. If we don't act, people will die.
This is about war. We need that intel.
The Golden Path is divided between two separate visions for Kyrat, Amita's and Sabal's. Sabal's culture and country have been brutalized and desecrated by Pagan's regime. In Bardra, he sees hope, a living Tarun Matara, a goddess in human form. He wants her paraded before the survivors of Banapur as a symbol of their resilience. Amita doesn't see a symbol. She sees a 14-year-old girl who deserves to live free of Kyrat's sexist traditions that keep everyone trapped in antiquity, the same way she saw a worthless tourist in RJ, not the prodigal son of Mohan Sabal spent all those valuable soldiers to rescue. She sees the future of Kyrat in export and industry, in finance and infrastructure, whatever the cost may be. Amita is a materialist, Sabal is an idealist, which manifests politically as progressivism and traditionalism. Caught between these visions, Bardra is the personification of Kyrat's future, and you will decide its fate. Aside from Ubisoft's insulting inclusion of numerous conversations where choices have consequence is repeated verbatim, with all the subtlety of life is strange.
But don't forget, RJ, choices have consequences.
Far Cry 4 establishes the who, what, and why cleanly. What impresses me first is the realization of Amita and Sabal. They're people, believable people with light and dark qualities and a similar balance to the light and dark of their beliefs. Amita, though sharp and sly, cares deeply for Kyrat's future. Her very presence as an unimposing young woman at the head of a militia is testament to an admirable resolve, as is her clothing, because clearly she has never listened to any guidance on how women should dress. Pink boots and an orange gloss puffer jacket? In 2014? Girl! Sabal, on the other hand, is inspiring, but zealous, warm, but rageful, and incorruptible, but stubborn. He stands proudly for what is right, even if he doesn't always know what is right. Neither one is idealized or demonized. Neither is so clearly the better person that choices would be any easier to make, and choices will not be easy to make. You'll hear their arguments at first in the pre-choice debate. Do you let Amita use the poppy fields to export poisonous street drugs to foreign markets? Or do you let Sabal burn Kyrat's best chance at financial stability? Morally bankrupt or literally bankrupt, as they themselves frame it? Do you choose to save a small group of hostages, or abandon them for intel that might indicate a larger attack? Should Bardra become Tarun Matara? The right answer is not clear. When the time comes to make your choice, things get a little bizarre. The prompts misleadingly read, "Here proposal," which implies consideration on your part and elaboration on their part, not RJ's unhesitant, unquestioning acceptance.
I can get you that intel.
What proposal? The prompt is false, and yet, having just said yes to someone, you're still allowed to back out and listen to the other leader, as if they would have anything different to say. It's bafflingly implemented, but it is also a minor gripe. So, as Ubisoft have repeatedly reminded us, after choice comes consequence. Let's find out for ourselves. In terms of gameplay, the scale of consequence differs immensely. At their most significant, Amita's defense of Utkarsh has you destroy the artillery base shelling it, while Sabal has you defend the streets of the village itself. Both fun missions, both completely different. At their least significant, with a brick factory or the statue, Amita and Sabal only differ by a few minor steps. Blow up X thing or don't, and somewhere in the middle lie the poppy fields and Jalendu Temple, where each leader's objectives are different in such a way that the experience of the same arena is significantly altered. Defending the fields is a very different matter from attacking them, because now you have to pay attention to multiple areas at once. Could it have been better? Vastly. But it is good enough. Aside from lending satisfactory credence to the narrative notion your choices do, in fact, matter, it also gives you a good reason to do another run, and it's strong enough that if you do, you won't be disappointed. Narrative consequence, on the other hand, is consistently small. You will never see the broader or longer-term effects of your choices. You will almost never see consequences in unexpected forms. What you will see is the leader you chose more often and a reaction from the leader you didn't. It's disappointing, but yet again, it's enough. Reactions are passionately performed and convincingly argued. Among the best points are made after the fact, and the despair of such driven, principled people can be an effective consequence itself. If RJ burns the opium, Amita smokes the copium, bringing up everything else it could have made.
Those fields you burned, they weren't just drugs. They were books, they were medicine. Oh, damn it, we could have built a proper clinic. But no, Sabal says drugs are bad and you torch our fucking future!
I don't think you understand.
I'm sorry. Did I speak out of turn? Should I walk 10 feet behind you with my head bowed?
10 feet? Nah. Amita would do. Like and subscribe. It would have been wonderful to have long-term consequence, but one speck of genuine regret is worth 1,000 broader details. Not just because it's a powerful emotion, but because it makes you think harder next time, and because any compulsion to see things from the other side is also a motive to play the game again. The one-word conclusion to all this is enough. It could have been a hell of a lot better, but Ubisoft get a lot out of a little, and not for the last time. At the plot level, the scene level, and the character level, what persists in Far Cry 4's story is a staggering efficiency. A few missions into Act 2, you meet with Bardra at a funeral for victims of the Banapur attack. Her place as a child whose life is controlled by the politics of her elders is realized elegantly when our conversation is cut short and she's sheeped off into some old dark temple, her head hung low, her body timid and submissive. She manages to tell you that Mohan didn't die fighting. He was murdered in his home, and suggests you see for yourself. For a good 10 seconds, there's an engrossing air of deepening mystery, but then you'll see the giant Y on the map, ensuring the player expects to meet Yogi and Reggie, the pair of absolute tits RJ will be surprised by inside. It's half worth it. Are they entertaining? Yes. Are they entertaining enough to justify being annoying? Debatable. Fortunately, you're drugged, and the phrase, "this pair of absolute tits," becomes much more literal. Waking up naked surrounded by topless women isn't an effective surprise to a guy with a silver play button, but it turns out they work for Nor, the first of Pagan's generals.
He abandoned his people to live in the decadence of America. But he returns in chains to face judgment. Your judgment, people of Kirat. AJK!
And equipped only with a machete she hid for you in the dirt, you are cast into Shanath Arena. It's a pretty good fight. It's a pretty fight. And it's immediately fascinating. What is this place? Why is Nur putting us in danger and aiding our survival at the same time? How are Yogi and Reggie involved? Questions soon answered. Nur doesn't want to be here or to do any of this, but Paul has her family. She used Yogi and Reggie to get you close and made you fight so as not to arouse suspicion. In exchange for her family's safety, she'll get you close to Paul. Mohan, his home, Yogi, Reggie, Shanath, Noor, and our next move are established in less than 15 minutes. With twists and secrecy, Ubisoft establish a strong sense of intrigue and simultaneously achieve their blistering efficiency. For the writer, the kidnapping is just legitimate teleportation. Throwing you in was the easiest way of introducing Shanath. Hours from here with Yuma and Durgesh, the same technique will be used again, as it was hours before, with Pagan and Sabal in the introduction. Far Cry 4's is not a plot that always works, but it moves quickly, never getting bogged down, boring, or belabored. It's also a story that seems always to succeed on the scene level. I'd like to give particular praise to Noor.
Walk with me.
You tried to kill me.
And now I'm not.
You know what? Fuck you.
Stop. Wait here. Just listen, please. Paul has my family. Until I know they're safe, I'm trapped here doing whatever Pagan wants me to do.
What does this have to do with me?
The Golden Path wants Paul dead. I need my family safe. We can help each other.
How?
I can get you back into a stronghold. Oh, and AJ. Take it easy on Reggie and Yogi. They're being played, just like you and I.
In 60 seconds, the dialogue and performance reveal an intricate battle of the healer she once was and the torturer she was forced to become. She is blunt and entirely unashamed in her willingness to use RJ's life as a means to an end, but her coldness has not made her evil. Go easy on Yogi and Reggie, she urges. She has sympathy for those in difficult situations. And yet, despite her own situation, Noor doesn't behave like a prisoner. She suits her role as Queen of Shanath. She's good at it. A passionate announcer, casual and commanding in herself. As Pagan suspects, part of her has begun to enjoy it. It's a fascinating nuance, and so despite her enslavement, you don't quite know if you can trust her. That tension is another good thing. Noor is exceptionally well realized. Your meeting with Paul comes soon after, posing as one of his victims. Paul is a fucking psychopath. His heartlessness is almost comedy.
I understand. I can't. I'm literally walking into a meeting right now.
But he works as well as he does because it feels completely genuine. He doesn't have a conscience, and he doesn't need one in Karat. This place was made for guys like us, he tells you, painting the notably murderous RJ with the same brush.
I am good at enhanced interrogation, and you're great at good old-fashioned slaughter! Come on, take a look around you. This place was built for guys like us!
To him, sifting through the jewels of the dead to find a gift for his 10-year-old daughter, reminding her to brush her teeth in the middle of an interrogation, and talking to his victims in a casual tone is entirely natural. He doesn't feel anything wrong, but he knows others do, and he can absolutely see the funny side as he pokes and teases their weak and predictable hearts. Coming from him, not forced by the writers, the comedy of his psychopathy lands, and it's certainly helped along by a fucking A-star performance from Travis Willingham.
Bad guy. And I'm a good guy, which means that I don't really want to hurt you. I only want to listen. And people tell me that I'm a fantastic listener.
Stuck in the boot of RJ's car, Paul makes honest small talk.
RJ? Come on, buddy, why are you doing this?
Before bursting into belly laughs at the discovery Noor really believed her family was still alive.
Her family's still alive? oh man, we killed them years ago!
I won't lie, I also laughed. Paul is in Far Cry 4 for 5 minutes. Because it takes 45 seconds to drive him to your destination and 2 minutes for the conversation to complete, you're going to miss most of it unless you know ahead of time and decide to slow or stop entirely. Because you're trying to escape in the introduction, you're probably going to miss his extensive torture of Darpan too. Needlessly, Ubisoft make a little even littler, and yet in the 3 fucking minutes that leaves him with, Paul still lands as a memorable character, just like the woman we've got to break the news to. Noor has outlived her usefulness to the Golden Path. Amita and Sabal want her dead. She's killed too many families to save her own. But that's not up to them. Once again, Far Cry 4 creates a difficult moral dilemma, because compared to telling her that all this evil was for nothing, the bullet might be mercy, if mercy is what she deserves. It's a deliciously horrible problem. It is the game's best choice. And yet, the choice accounts for only a fraction of the strength of the scene. nor, like Paul, is denied dimension, development, and time. Beyond a basic empathy for her situation, we don't much care, because we've known her for 5 minutes. But it is not those things that gives her suicide impact. It is everything else. It is the performance and the dialogue that so vividly realize a woman who has suffered unimaginable cruelty. It is the perspective that compares Noor the healer with her life's work, clamoring for another drop of blood. It is the simple fucking beauty of it. You can't forget a sight like this. It is frequently stunning how much Far Cry 4 gets out of its competence at the scene level, and it is frequently lucky it has that to rely on. It's now time to talk about Far Cry 4's side content, and I'm guessing Noor won't mind if we start with Shanath. The last thing you expect from Far Cry 4's most literal FPS arena is a fresh take on its combat, but that's exactly what you'll find in Shanath. Entering from each of the 6 golden doors surrounding the kill box, an independent faction will fight to be the last one standing. It might be a pack of animals, it's probably a team of colored soldiers, but whoever it is, factional conflict is guaranteed, which puts you at a life-saving advantage. Cover is sparse in Shanath, and enemies are plentiful, but you are spared the imminent death that would usually bring about by the faction split keeping your enemies just as occupied fighting each other, which means you're going to want to keep it that way. If one faction is wiped out entirely, everyone else is more likely to aim for you. So balancing the numbers is a crucial tactic for long-term success. If there's 4 blues and 2 yellows, you try to aim for the blues. It's a newly relevant form of target prioritization, and the first of Shanath's interesting mechanical differences. Here is the second. With a raised outer platform, death from above is easily initiable. With consistently distracted enemies, backs are consistently turned, which makes standard takedowns especially accessible. Instant kills are an attractive prospect anywhere, but in Shanath, ammunition is scarce. You're looking to save it where you can. So free instant kills makes the deal even sweeter. With opportunity and incentive, Shanath pressures the most brutal playstyle possible. It makes for a vicious gladiatorial fantasy, and though the problems with enemy melee continue to weaken the skill base of takedowns, it's skill-based enough for Shanath's emphasis of them not to harm the depth overall. Other good mechanical ideas include the arena's resource economy. You can pick up bullets and an AK from fallen fighters, but the good stuff, grenades, syringes, and powerful weapons are thrown in from the stands as tribute. There's always something you want somewhere in the arena, or about to be thrown in. So in addition to being a cool stylistic idea, they also introduce a further momentum to Shanath, as you regularly risk exposure to go get them. It's also worth mentioning the limited supply of red barrels, which you can use sparingly at the opportune moment, and the golden doors, which make enemy spawns precisely predictable, allowing you to consistently set up ambushes. Small mechanical toppings to a large mechanical success. Combat in Shanath is strong, distinct, and distinct in a way that delivers a palpable gladiatorial fantasy. There's machetes and scarcity and chaos and tribute and glory to bask in at the end. Shanath is more than its staggeringly pretty face. It makes you feel like Russell Crowe. And that guy from the movie. There is just one problem. It's good, but it's not as good as it thinks it is. There is a ranking system from 1 to 15. You get the Bushman assault rifle at rank 10. You get nothing for anything else. Which begs the question, why is there a ranking system if it only means anything once? And more importantly, why in the fuck is the grind to rank 10 so long? Shanath has the depth to sustain repetition, but not indefinitely. Not for 15 hours. I'd know. I've done it, and the support group meets every Thursday. Now, Paul is dead, Noor is no more, which means, as you'll soon see, there is no better time to talk about Far Cry 4's fortresses. Each member of Karat's Rogues Gallery command what is best described as a mega outpost. They're big, highly manned, guarded by snipers, surrounded by minefields, reinforced with helicopters, and look who's back. Walls! So to get in, you'll want to find each fortress's secret entrance. You'll want to, but you don't have to. The defenses are not insurmountable, allowing you to challenge yourself to your own liking. What's more is that each of the fortresses has their own character. Though Paul and Yuma's are quite similar, half of Noor's is bored into a mountain with large exposed spaces throughout, and part of Pagan's is a dungeon with a sprawl of tight interconnected buildings in the courtyard. These structural differences are made especially impactful by the secret entrance pathways you're most likely to use. They're not very secret. Take the path up Nor's Mountain for a uniquely vertical shot on the courtyard, after which you'll find yourself within that interior, for the first time tackling an outpost-like level from the deepest point outwards. Pagan similarly guides you through the dungeon first. I love fortresses. I've missed them in every entry since, because they're well-designed levels, because they're allowed to experiment with these atypical designs, but also because of what they represent. Mastery. Games often benefit greatly from the inclusion of ultimate endgame goals, armor or swords or bosses, whose foremost purpose is to be something to aspire to give you a reason to progress, and once finally achieved, to give all that progress and your playthrough a sense of finality. Crowning Edward Kenway, who began with nothing, King of the Seas after having defeated all 4 legendary ships, brings a sense of mastery on par with the Platinum Trophy. But it's not that they're literally the best gear, or literally the toughest challenge, it's that they're characterized as ultimate. Literally the toughest challenge in Far Cry 4 is restricting yourself to a pistol and never upgrading, but that's not the point. The true satisfaction of a fortress is that you're taking on a fortress, the biggest and scariest outpost in Karat, commanded by a cock goblin of particular narrative significance. Capturing Yuma's castle feels like a great and final victory, where beating a particularly difficult series of shacks would not. It was a loss when Far Cry dropped the idea, and understanding that their greatest quality is immaterial explains why their one and only problem is their one and only problem. Capturing a fortress doesn't actually hurt the corresponding villain, but capturing a villain does hurt their fortress. It weakens them. You'll find the doors smashed in, you'll find fewer guards, and there'll be fewer reinforcements if you're spotted. This is very likely to be the version of the fortress you fight. Villains are captured quickly in what isn't a long story, which means fortresses are only at their full strength briefly. Their characterization, meanwhile, as the biggest and scariest thing, encourages doing them late, so the problem is reliable. If the fortress is a symbol of strength, and they are not weakened by the player's intention, then their weakening brings a weaker sense of mastery in taking them. It's literally and figuratively self-defeating. Mercifully, it's not actually that bad. Fortresses are still tough, weakened or not, which is why this is a significant problem, and not a crippling one. Now, when you clear a fortress like any outpost or any bell tower, you will unlock new activities, which is Far Cry's way of saying basic copy-pasted gameplay scenarios. And there are no story-based side missions. Are you rolling your eyes? Because I am. But putting disappointment aside, having an abundance of basic gameplay scenarios is a good thing. It's true, activities aren't exactly filling a big gap in the market, because if you walk 50 yards in any direction, you'll stumble into a basic gameplay scenario. But from their stratification, you get reliable access to specific parts of the game. Hostage rescue, animal attack, supply run. Cool. Well, it's usually cool. Not every part of Far Cry is strong enough to succeed singled out. Driving, for instance. It has great feel, but low depth. Armored escort is another weak link. You're placed on the roof of a truck and given a grenade launcher to defend it with. It's fun, but it's a glorified turret section, so it's fun for 5 minutes. At which point you might be tempted to step off, perhaps try defending it in a vehicle of your own. Yeah, nice try, fucko. The moment you leave that roof, the truck will grind to a halt. The shallowest way to play is the only way to play, and that, isolated, can't support one mission, let alone 10. In spite of the odd mishap, Far Cry 4's so-called activities are ultimately an asset, but the rabbit hole goes just a little deeper. I said there were no story-based side missions, and there aren't, but there is something imitating them. Longinus's missions after a mandatory expedition to the Himalayas become repeated and optional. After an introductory cutscene, you tail a commander to a hidden bunker, bash the doors in, smash the heads in, nick the blood diamonds, and then fight your way out against yet another wave of enemies. It repeats about 5 times. It's a solid activity. But despite the character and cutscenes, I still can't find the story. The mission itself is empty, even of dialogue, and in the introductory cutscenes, nothing of narrative substance is ever said. They simply introduce the same gameplay scenario in a slightly different way. Jesus is cool, blood diamonds are cringe, go shove your Glock up this guy's minge. Change the wording, throw in a Bible quote, and repeat it 4 times. It's always entertaining. I'd always take it over the text box every other activity used for exposition. But you always know exactly where his mad preaching is going, so it gets less entertaining very, very quickly. which leads us on to Phineas and Herb. Their psychedelic trips are the second, last, and definitely least side quest chain to exist within a bafflingly hollow narrative body, whose quirky introductions quickly suffer for doing nothing more than reiterating the exact same thing. What sucks in particular is the effect of repetition on the missions themselves. The one appeal of a Disco Biscuit trip is that it might show you something you haven't seen before, but Far Cry reduces it to a recipe: some colors, a slightly distorted musical track, and one funky combination: balls on fire, exploding monkeys, cars falling from the sky. They're wacky for 2 minutes, then they become predictable, and tripping balls start sucking balls. Points of interest are named locations in Karat, each exhibited after clearing the closest bell tower, and each enriched by a loot-based gathering loop. Relative to Karat's scale, points of interest are very common, but unfortunately they fail to be interesting. I found one crash plane. It was a highlight, mostly because it was the only crash plane I ever found. The 15th sacred tree I found was not a highlight, nor was the 15th sacred shrine, or the 15th unremarkable cave. Their modesty is also common. They share a lack of ambition. You'll never see a big sacred tree, or a forest of sacred trees, or a cavern instead of a cave, or a cave with anything interesting in it. It wouldn't be fair to call them featureless, but it'd be nuts to call them fascinating. Indeed, I imagine they were made at first to simply be believable features of the world, and that they were called points of interest sometime after. Which leaves us with the loot. Every significant location in Karat is brimming with masks, manny wheels, posters, journals, chests, dead bodies. They're small rewards, and each gathered with minor effort. It's quite addicting. It's meant to be, and it's not meant to be much else. When you loot those bodies or open those chests, what you get is a sum of money and a handful of items. But items cannot be crafted, stripped down, or anything other than sold. So what they actually are is a different way to express a sum of money. A flat cash sum would be incalculably less appealing than this abundance of reward, but it's illusory, which in combination with the absolute meaninglessness of collectibles like masks, manny wheels, and posters, creates Far Cry 4's addictive gathering loop out of thin air, out of nothing. It's impressive as it is insulting, and in complete absence of substance, it also lacks the one thing that can make that work. Crackdown, Spider-Man, Assassin's Creed, meaningless collectibles and shallow rewards have incentivized the deeper task of going to get them. Since Banjo-Kazooie released in the 1800s, there was nothing interesting about the contents of Rome's chests or the function of its feathers, but between you and them was the good part, a movement or a pathfinding challenge. Through this, Ubisoft could get more out of their level design. And in Far Cry 4, of all its collectibles, only masks of Ylang are hidden. You track them down by the sound they emit, which is just vague enough to make it a meaningful challenge. Otherwise, there is nothing between you and Far Cry 4's collectibles, and all that's left is the hollow shell of a gameplay loop, enough to hook your neurochemistry, but not to satisfy on any deeper level, which produces a shallow, frustrating, and contradictory experience. You're not having fun, but you're spending a lot of time doing it. It's an extra 2 hours grafted onto the runtime, 2 hours of vapid zombified engagement. Well, 1 hour and 50 minutes. There is an exception, 5 to be exact. Caverns, not caves, that contain something much better than money. Something that take a traversal challenge to enter. Something beautiful and very sacred. The final form of side content. Thunka paintings that retell the myth of Kalinag, an ancient karate warrior sent by his king to find Shangri-La. The sense of myth is immediately pronounced. Kalinag recollects his story in the past tense, speaking with the stoicism of a duty-bound warrior, and yet the wisdom of a man who had seen impossible things. He speaks with his native tongue, translated for you in text, and 2 minutes in, he's made friends with a sentient tiger. You feel like you're playing an ancient myth. It's very well framed. Shangri-La the place reveals itself as basically heaven, which is remarkable. There are hundreds of games set in hell, but very few that pay even a visit to the big gold yonder. It's also annoying, because now telling you that Shangri-La is one of the best heavens in gaming doesn't mean shit. But I don't think you'll need that much convincing. Fucking look at it. On calm winds, the leaves float peacefully between wine-red meadows and the brilliant golden warmth of an ancient sun. The mountains are gods and the gods are mountains. The beasts are white and the colors are impossibly pure. If Ubisoft keeps abusing women, they'll never get to see for themselves. But if heaven really does look like this, would you be disappointed? It's staggeringly beautiful, and behind its pretty face, there is something more. Shangri-La manages to capture in immensity what matters above all to a heaven, being above all, divinity. There are no crude delights. There are miracles, strange and mystifying. Bells that ring with impossible force, wheels that spin at impossible speeds, statues who move their heads, and the statues, like the halls and mountains, are colossal. The intimidation of scale is the oldest trick in the architectural book to make you feel small in the presence of something greater. But despite these greater powers, Shangri-La remains utterly silent. The wise and ancient tiger never says a word. You are guided by forces unseen and unheard. It feels distant from you. There is a sense you're not meant to understand it, nor could you. And towering above the psychotic, sin-ridden Karatas Ajay makes being towered over by the divine enlightened Shangri-La all the more pronounced by contrast. It's an utterly convincing heaven. The mythic framing and the feel of the place are fresh and enthralling. They come to define the experience, and they make it very easy to justify defending it from the demons who want it for themselves. The Rakshasa, or as I like to call them, the 72 Virgins. Roasted! Their design is particularly strong. They thrash and flicker with a crazed bloodlust. They scream some wretched tongue in some distorted pitch. The black pits behind their expressionless masks reveal the chilling absence of their soul. Also, they're blue. Shangri-La is red, which says Invader. This is one of Far Cry 4's best designs. Beating their asses will be a different matter. There are 5 missions in Shangri-La. You arrive, you look around, you take your screenshots, obviously, and then, armed with a new ability, you enter a substructure of 2 or 3 arenas, ending with a final fight for the Bell of Enlightenment, whose ring marks the end of the mission. The structure does the best it can. There's a surprisingly strong sense of rising tension as the scale of conflict escalates throughout the mission. But ultimately, there's not much for a structure to do, because Shangri-La gives it only one real thing to be distributed. There is no stealth. There are no movement challenges. Its substance is combat and combat alone, which is a lot of pressure to put on just one system. Can it stand up to the heat? The tiger you meet a few minutes in is a designated kill. Simple depth. Who do you want to spend it on? For you, things are more elaborate. Kalinag's takedown window is bigger than RJ's, and he has automatic access to knife throw takedown and aerial takedown. The Rakshasa, meanwhile, cluster together as they rush in for melee. They're lining themselves up, but it's an opportunity you must take with care, because you're still vulnerable during the animation. You want the group close enough to most benefit from multi-takedowns and to quickly initiate a new takedown, but distant enough to finish your animation without other Rakshasa closing the gap and damaging you. The pursuit of this balance, with careful positioning and wise use of the tiger, makes a simple but strong foundation for Shangri-La's combat. Its success is similar to Shanath, because the experience has also been altered in such a way to fulfill a specific role. Kalinag's, an ancient warrior who fought with a blade and the bow. Oh shit, I gave it away. In Mission 2, Kalinag gets the bow. Now, unless you're a 10th playthrough nutcase like me, bows are not a good idea in open combat. But this is not a normal bow. Aim it and time slows. Because the ability quickly depletes and also quickly replenishes, the slow-mo is divided into a series of short bursts. That's how the momentum of the fight stays intact. And most importantly, the challenge. There's just enough time for the skilled player to nail multiple headshots at once, but too little time to make getting even one effortless. The bow is made viable, not trivial, and mastery is rewarded. It's very well implemented. Mission 3's expansion is the multi-shot bow. A fan of 3 arrows are fired at once, making it almost impossible to miss a centered target at close range. The bow becomes a shotgun. That creates aggression, and from aggression, variety. Kalinag plays different and as if he is getting stronger. Both good things. Mission 4 gives you an elephant. You can now elephant. And that's the end of Kalinag's moveset. The rest of Shangri-La's mechanical ideas are in his 2 remaining enemies. Big Rakshasa are up first. They're addicted to cheeseburgers instead of meth. But more importantly, they pose an interesting challenge. A flamethrower, that's a close quarters area of denial attack. But once you have them staggered with the tiger or a well-placed headshot, you need to hit the killing takedown quickly, or they'll stand right back up. So you're positioning between a distance great enough for safety and close enough for readiness. It's a strong challenge. It's also a very similar challenge to that of the standard Rakshasa, which severely limits their ability to diversify Shangri-La's combat. They're tough, that can be good, but they're not very interesting in Shangri-La. And they're also broken. The flamethrower's true range doesn't exactly align with the visual effect, which kinda matters in a fight about neither being too close or too far. And this is still Far Cry 4, a game where you can't put out the fire actively killing you until you've caught enough fire for the prompt to appear. They're decent in concept, weak in Shangri-La, and irritating in Far Cry. Who's roasted now? Up last are the Wolven Rakshasa. Like suicide grunts, they rush close, blow themselves up, and through that, challenge a quick and decisive response. kill it or get away, fight or flight. It's interesting. It fills a niche in Shangri-La. It works properly, and there's an added bonus. One shot kills. 2 shots detonates the corpse for use against other Rakshasa. Killing wolves as close to the group as possible and luring enemies towards wolven corpses are the strong and final touches to Shangri-La's combat. So, now it's time to ask the question, is the combat good enough to support the campaign alone? The answer is not ideal. Barely. Shangri-La is deep, but it cuts far more than it introduces. It's not as deep as Karat. One good weapon and an interesting enemy is not going to change the fact that there's one weapon, and no real sandbox otherwise. And with depth in short supply, length becomes Shangri-La's biggest problem. At 25 minutes a mission, things start to drag. If it were 5 or 10 minutes less, that never would have happened. The campaign is decent. The stage it rests on is godly. Though imperfect, this is the best of Far Cry 4's side content. We will return to Shangri-La when it matters most. For now, it's back to looting shrines, psycho torture, and killing for sport. Ah, Karat. But its cruelty is not the only thing Shangri-La brings to light by contrast. Compared with a setting that realized itself with enough care to have its protagonist speak Hindi, the weak links in Karat's portrayal come into sharper focus. You drive a lot in Far Cry 4. The radio host matters. And this is not going to make me popular, but I'm about to start some fucking Rabbi Ray drama.
You're listening to Rabbi Ray Rana on Radio Free Kirat.
Rabbi Ray Rana is mildly entertaining at best. He's not insightful, he's not interesting, he's not witty, he's not funny. Each episode of his show is extremely similar to every other. There are too few episodes to last the entire game, which leads to numerous repeats. And worst of all, he actively takes you out of the setting, because the one thing he is the last thing he should be. An American teenager.
Rabbi Ray Rana here with some good news for my listeners.
Unlike the many other Americans in Far Cry 4 who are actually American, Rabbi Ray Rana is a karate who has been weirdly and nonsensically Americanized.
OMG, Ajay Gale.
I mean, just listen to this shit.
I want to judge. I'm not a narc. I partake in the local herb. I'll smoke one with you, but I don't beat. That's not for me, okay? I'm a basic guy. I'm a simple guy. I like vanilla ice cream, and I like 3 positions, okay? Missionary, house, everything you're wearing with gasoline.
Far Cry 4 is trying to build this image of seclusion, oppression, mysticism, and of a culture that only a few decades back had girls marrying at the age of 6. I don't mind jokes from the radio host. I mind him having an identical vernacular to James Charles. I mind him describing the revolution as Obama levels of change, going off about how white girls shouldn't be twerking because they don't have fat enough dump trucks, and saying,
let's talk about the real crime that Pagan men is committing. I'm talking about the fashion crimes.
In response to Pagan's cruelty, this is a crime. Does Pagan need to be deposed, or does he need to take accountability for his weak apology video?
Again, terribly sorry for what happened before.
Thanks to Rabbi Ray Reddit, I can't fucking tell. On my latest runs, I prefer to keep the radio off and appreciate the Rabbi Ray panorama. But unfortunately, there's no escape from Americanization there either. Let's just do a head count, shall we? Amita, Sabal, Badra, and Kalinag are pure karate. Longinus is African, Yogi and Reggie are vaguely British, RJ, Nor, and Depleur are American, with Herc and Willis being aggressively American, and Rabbi Ray Rana being offensively American. Yuma, when she speaks English, is also American, and then you've got Pagan's American mannerisms.
Really, guys? We're not checking for these anymore?
Pagan's American pop culture references.
Let's see how much Kanye is going for. Do you follow him on Twitter? He's gold.
And the upcoming CIA subplot. You get the picture. Some level of Americanization is believable. This much, coincidentally emerging from everything and everywhere? It's forced, it's pandering, and it's no big deal, but it's conspicuous, which is why it's to the detriment of the sense of setting. Now let's change the topic and talk about that CIA subplot. After Nora and Paul go down, you'll get a call from Willis Huntley, secret agent, who returns from Far Cry 3, not as the disturbed, paranoid basement dweller he used to be, but as a full-on caricature. He doesn't speak English, he speaks in sporting metaphors, crude references, and Hollywood cliches.
Both patriots, though. Both the type that'll put your hand over your gosh darn heart when you hear the Star-Spangled Banner at a 4th of July ball game.
And he doesn't speak human either. He speaks in manipulation, incentives, and on a need-to-know basis. Willis is very well done, from the writing to the performance, which is ironic, because the voice artist is Canadian. In return for information on Mohan Gale's death, you're put up to Overwatch on Willis's meeting with a mercenary. But he's not alone. He doesn't get to bring friends. You can't pick off their snipers with one of your own, because noise would blow Willis's cover. The need to get up close is what makes the expansiveness of the airport an interesting challenge. There are zip lines and a tunnel, you can run right across, and you can make things a little easier if you're confident with the bow. Every time I've done this mission, I've done it a different way. That number's in the double digits, so consider this high praise, but it won't make much difference to Willis. Well, congratulations, he got himself caught. What's the next step in his master plan? Relying on you to kill everyone, of course, but the file you were promised is still on that plane. Now, perhaps you're wondering why Willis wouldn't shoot the man, currently stealing it. I'd bet it's to justify a set piece. Crashing this plane. With no survivors. He didn't fly so good. Done in a cutscene, over in a moment. The tested formula of any set piece that only exists for the trailer. It's not uncool, but it's glaringly out of place. Who's this guy meant to be? RJ Garley can now independently Mission Impossible a moving plane? And since when would he, for the sake of a file whose knowledge he has never before pursued with such intent? We open the file to find it redacted, and Willis knew it would be. He tells us that if we want those black bars removed, we'll help him draw out Pagan's second-in-command by killing her lieutenants in the Himalayan mountains. This composes the rest of Act 2. Willis keeps his word, throwing you scraps of information as you cross off names on his list.
Fact, your mom was Hakuna Matata, or whatever the heck they call the young girls. Fact, your mom was spying on Pagan, even though she liked the guy.
We learn that after Mohan sent his wife Ishwari to spy on Pagan, she fell in love with him and defected. Mohan tried to have her killed for abandoning the cause. Most of what we learn, though, merely shapes the impression of a larger depth, asking questions and raising subjects without providing answers or elaboration. We're told of Pagan's betrayals, of Yuma's deep involvement with the Triad, of Mohan's past work with the CIA, and that supposedly Yuma lies at the center of all this. That is all we're told. And that lacking will eventually become important. But in the moment, it works. It's interesting. You're invested in learning more. And this clandestine wet work, its secrecy and mystery and intrigue, colors what is in fact a series of 6 miserable combat arenas with a remarkably captivating tone. It feels like a CIA subplot, and that is its only redeeming feature. These missions are the worst missions in Far Cry 4. Let's find out why. The first major difference is that we aren't in an open world. You can safely reposition from the outside of any arena in Karat. You can just walk around. But in the Himalayas, you can only enter from a specified entrance, and you must progress through one of the arena's lanes, which means you're always near to or surrounded by guards, and any dead bodies discovered are likely to shake the guards up in such a way it will be very difficult to stay hidden from. It gets tougher. For one, enemy population is very high in the Himalayas. There are more eyes to see you, and more eyes to spot those bodies. For another, cover is often thin and sparse in these arenas, and when it isn't, buildings often lack interiors, which gives you far fewer opportunities to hide and reposition. Enemy snipers, meanwhile, are common, and dispatching enemies is much harder to do quietly, because their padded winter coats makes them a 2-shot body shot with silent weapons. If you want to stay stealth, it's headshots only, which is made even harder because they're white, like everything around them. The Himalayas are difficult, that's fine. They're also a savage difficulty spike. That's a problem. But it isn't why they're bad. They're bad because of what is more likely than ever to happen next. You're gonna be detected, you're gonna get into a fight, and you're gonna wish you hadn't. Here's why. This is Far Cry 4. Enemies are ferociously accurate at all ranges, so if you're exposed, you will take damage. Healing, meanwhile, is an extensive process where a full recovery can take upwards of 15 seconds, during which time you are slow and vulnerable. Damage then is punished twice, once when you take it, then again when you sacrifice time, agency, and safety to heal. Since damage comes from exposure, this should encourage considered use of the levels around you to position and approach your enemies without revealing yourself to their weapons. But what happens when those levels don't exist? What happens when cover is so sparse or stunted that you can't move without exposure? What happens is you don't move. What happens is an imprisonment of slow, static, repetitive play, and quite a few deaths in attempted defiance of this tedious behavior. Deaths often at the hands of exposure punishment's most ruthless enforcers. Snipers. They're quick to fire when you give them a shot, they rarely miss, they'll cut through your health reserve in seconds, and they're in half the arenas up here. The walls of play close in even tighter. And we're not done just yet. Consider this. Because you're not in the open world, there is one place in each of these arenas you can't be flanked from. The entrance, which makes the entrance the safest tactical position, and which means that even if you get further into the arena before being detected, you're still safest running back and camping the door. It's silly. It almost feels like you're exploiting the game, and it's the cherry on top to what are, on average, the campaign's worst missions. This isn't a W, it's an L. The CIA subplot ends abruptly. You weren't killing Yuma's lieutenants, you were killing the CIA's loose ends. And come on, you don't really expect to be told what that means, do you? Willis, with his right arm, pushes the man who single-handedly blew up a moving plane into Yuma's jaw.
Hello. Did we enjoy our time with the CIA?
No! Dagesh Prison succeeds. First as an introduction to Yuma, who stands out immediately for giving Pagan shit and not being stabbed to death with a fountain pen. Why? How? Where does she get her pink-haired eye? Who knows, but it builds anticipation. Second, because it has Pagan in it.
Now, RJ, I know this is hard, but consider this tough love, prison love. After all, you have a suite with a spectacular view.
Mostly, though, because it's actually a damn good level. For you, Dagesh is a prison to break from. For Yuma, it's a prison to break people. And I believe it. Like the pit from The Dark Knight Rises, freedom is dangled close enough to tempt and torture, but far enough to ever be reached. That's why the doors aren't locked. There's no need. And the frenzied madness this place has understandably inflicted on its prisoners sets the mood very, very well. Now, unfortunately, everyone else is too dead, too nuts, or too stoned to sing Deshi Basara, so you'll need to make the climb with the rope. The rope buried at the end of those passages, and guarded by an old familiar foe. Rakshasa. These little shits were creepy enough when you could kill them with a click, but now, it's dark, it's tight, you're powerless. This is Far Cry 4's first and only horror section, and the Rakshasa succeed as the monster to be scared of. The gameplay arises from the passages themselves. They're interconnected. They're just interconnected enough to create pathfinding choices, which you will make based on sound, shadow, glances, and your own bravery. It's a robust game of cat and mouse, and a surprisingly effective horror segment for the 2 minutes it matters. Now, you may have some questions. For example, what employment benefits could Yuma possibly offer the Rakshasa? Well, they do have a common interest. As Yuma explains, the weakness stricken in Pagan following his love for Ishwari led the once loyal Yuma to the search for greater powers, nested and forgotten in the Himalayan mountains. She became obsessed, like the Rakshasa, with claiming the power of Shangri-La for herself. Perhaps a little too obsessed.
And I will accomplish what Pagan failed to do, and build a truly great civilization here in Chimera!
Okay, Yuma, that's enough mimosas for today. Slight overacting aside, I like this narrative beat, which is good because it's just about the only real narrative beat the Himalayas has. I like it not for the depth it lends to Yuma's character and not because it's a clever twist, but because it is immersive. And it is immersive because it is an example of narrative cohesion. That is, one thing having a believable influence on everything else. In Far Cry 4, Kyrat's fictional culture is extremely cohesive. It exists not just in lore pages, but in the physical landscape and the minds of the people themselves. Yalang, for example, a wicked demon of their mythology, is feared, even by a prisoner here in Dagesh, who would rather die than be caught by the pursuing dark he imagined was Yalang. A serial killer marks his work with Yalang's mask in the mainland, where the Rakshasa are reviled and their vanquisher Kalanag is worshipped through shrines, prayer, or like Yuma, through obsession. It is thoroughly engrossing to happen upon a wounded ally in a mission, then return thousands of years later and find it venerated as a religious figure, because when an individual entity can be seen as part of a larger whole, the whole is given credibility. A world feels like a world when its parts feel connected. Walking through the magnificent ruins of Kalanag's followers, fighting those who were sent to take his power, and hiding from his demons in the halls of a woman possessed by his myth. That is what makes the Himalayas, and Dagesh especially, feel a part of Kyrat, not a separate space for separate levels. It's immersive. I like it. Having fell to the bottom thanks to this complete fucking dickweed of a Rakshasa, there is one final distance to the exit. It is excellent, because it manages to succeed as a scene, to convey the experience of an unarmed man trying to escape from a merciless Bastille, without sacrificing its mechanical integrity. By using the blizzard to deny you sight, and the absence of objective markers to deny you certainty, play becomes less intentional but more improvisational, and as it does, it becomes tense, because with the unknown comes fear. I appreciate particularly that there's no fail state on detection, and that there's no point you need to reach before things are allowed to descend into chaos, if for no other reason than by meeting the player's actions with believable diegetic consequences, you once again deepen their connection to the moment. It is inevitable you are spotted eventually, and Durgesh goes out with a bang in both senses of the word. It's tough, but the defensible sniper tower relieves it of severe exposure punishment. Of all the fights in the Himalayas, it is in prison where you are most free, and its difficulty, caused by your blurred vision and the sheer number of enemy guards below, now enhances the brutality of what is an incredibly cinematic fight, having to make a run for cover, fighting tooth and nail with what you can find, picking off faint outlines in the blizzard as bullets crack through the air. It really, really works. I really like Durgesh, and I struggle to think of a mission from Far Cry 3, 5, or 6 with better gameplay that didn't rely on the usual outpost battle formula. Having collapsed in the snow, you wake up to whichever Golden Path leader has your Patreon support. It's unexpected consequence, which is why it's an effective touch for the sense of actions having consequence, even if it doesn't entirely fit for Amita, cold pragmatist she is, to waste so much time sitting by an unconscious person's bedside.
I have to go. There's still a war going on.
If there's pressing matters to attend to, why were you watching me like a fucking Netflix binge? Her abrupt exit almost suggests she's hiding something, a feeling maybe, or a plan, but this goes nowhere. It's just a poorly written scene. You also wake up to a mission with Yogi and Reggie, 20 meters from your front door, and another tense affair with Amita miles further. These distances are a distribution technique. That's what I want to talk about next. Far Cry 4, in a step away from Far Cry 3's rigidity, distributes missions in sets, and allows the set to be completed in any order the player wishes, which gives Ubisoft two ways to optimize the campaign's distribution. They can make sure each set contains a diverse range of missions, and they can choose where on the map to place them. Traveling long distances is time-consuming, and fast travel is unlocked slowly, so the closer the mission, the better the chances you do it next. Yogi and Reggie are light, they're closest after Durgesh, which was tense. That's wise. Like stealing blood diamonds for Longinus, which is closer after defending the monastery for the Golden Path, than defending the next thing for the Golden Path. You always have a choice, but the game makes it easy to make the best choice. Usually, that is. Sets aren't always chosen well. Distances aren't always smart, as Act 2 previously demonstrated. Willis's third mission is a large Himalayan arena battle, which appears after and next to his second mission, which is a sequence of 5 consecutive Himalayan arena battles. But just before, there were 2 Golden Path defenses, the factory and the statue, cramped up close. Why wasn't one of them delayed to pace out Willis? If you have any DLC, then Herc's first mission, a Himalayas expedition, appears after and next to Longinus' second mission, which is also a Himalayas expedition, and the pre-order missions, all 3 of which are Himalayas expeditions. Because of this, it's not unlikely you experience 3 of the same mission type in a row, and for slightly different reasons, Yogi and Longinus have the same problem. Their first missions are mandatory. They are presented as any other main mission would be, so you won't know they've become a repetitive chain of optional side quests until you experience a repeat premise and realize it. This is not the only problem Far Cry 4 is going to have with playing the right cards at the right time. Now, onto that tense affair with Amita. The time has come to breach the north. You're going to steal a fuel truck, play some nutcase Indian pop, and ram it right into the King's Gate. Act 3 is the war for Karat. When the dust settles and you set foot into the north, the temperature of the game immediately rises. Missions are straight to the point, explosive, and conclusive. The north itself is the perfect stage. Amongst red trees and savage terrain, the north knows no quiet. Spawn rate is set on fire, boiling Karat into a near constant battle of armies, allies, animals, and you. Soldiers come equipped with body armor as standard, and trucks can be mounted with grenade launchers instead of machine guns. It is the best sense of climax any Far Cry has ever known. The story's not all that wins here, it's also really fucking fun. Turning up the dials on Far Cry 4's dynamism doesn't wear it out, though it can mean more of the same fights. It also means more new fights, as all of the separate pieces become that much more likely to meet at the same time. The wildest things that can happen begin to happen often. A hovercraft flies past Wild Sambar, and a rhino begins to chase me through 2 separate faction battles. The north is the setting of a quarter of the game, but of half my favorite memories. Another key benefit is the challenge. You've gotten better at the game since you stepped into the South. You've also gotten better things, guns, holsters, and abilities. But the South grows no tougher. It becomes dangerously possible to demolish encounters thoughtlessly. The North fixes that, and its qualities just go on. Red forests are one visual feature of a wide and stunning palette. Green water, falling snow, superior rock textures. The South can show its age, but the North holds up to the visual scrutiny of today. What's more is an abundance of interesting outposts. The ChimerainaSuit sits atop a hill crest. The KEO mine surrounds a giant hole. These are uncharacteristically severe verticalities that bring fresh thinking to the encounter. There are also smaller interesting quirks and more familiar outpost designs, like a network of underground passages. Do you see the problem here? The North is on fire! But why is it on fire now? Outposts are side content. Visuals matter most when you're spending the most time in the open world, not in Act 3, where the climactic momentum propels you through the main storyline towards the end credits, which are a major cutoff point for player retention, but in Act 1 and 2, whose slower pace permits distraction. Every time I enter the North, I'm amazed at how good this game can look, and simultaneously confused at why I'm learning this with an hour and a half left to go. How much would be better appreciated, and how much would not be missed, if it only came a little earlier? But there is another, harsher way to look at this. The North isn't just good, and it isn't just better than the South. The North is good where the South was bad. Its rock textures were poor. It suffered from a lack of visual variation, and so did its disappointingly uniform outposts. The South needed what the North has in excess. It should have been introduced earlier. Act 3 would not have lost its stage.
Bring it on.
Up next, as Pagan announces on live TV, is RJ's showdown with Yuma. She gets the drop on you in a cave, but instead of death by bullet, she opts for death by crack, and in her dream world, we are helpless to suffer her endless ranting, once again, about Pagan being a tier 3 simp and Ishwari being a skank-ass hoe. Yuma disarms RJ with the power of having breasts and dupes him into getting ass blasted by a Rakshasa, then blasted by a gun, which then leads into a boss fight. With Yuma appearing as Kalinag, it's characteristically nuts for a Yuma level. The fight itself is reasonably strong, requiring you to stun Kalinag with an environmental explosion, then rush in for the takedown. But fuck me, does it all end too soon. Yuma Lao, General of the Royal Army, Warden of Durgesh, and the only other person alive Pagan gives a shit about. Yuma Lao, villain of Far Cry 4 whose tail we've spent the last 2 hours chasing. Who Yuma is, and the role she has played so far, create much bigger expectations for payoff than repeating the same speech we've already heard, remaining entirely static as a character, and going down easily. Just like RJ's mum. But there's another gut punch too. Yuma lies at the center of it all, said Willis. You want answers? All roads lead to her. And even though he only ever meant to manipulate you, he wasn't wrong. Yuma is Triad royalty. She dealt with Willis to bring RJ to Durgesh. Something had changed in Pagan's regime to justify the CIA's exit from Karat, and they were deeply involved beforehand. Only more questions are raised, valid questions, and you continue to expect answers after Durgesh. But where did the road lead? To nothing, and Yuma's cold body, lying only in the center of a nondescript cave. It's here the disappointment truly hits you. It doesn't even make sense. As if the CIA would leave Karat without controlling Amita's poppy fields. Yuma's fortress in a poetic symmetry shares her premature death. It's accessible only from the north. Yuma dies 2 missions into the north. That's 30 minutes at a brisk pace, which makes her fortress's weakening so probable that they might as well not have bothered designing a version at full strength at all. In the wake of Yuma's death, the Golden Path returned to the spotlight. Tensions between Amita and Sabal have risen, but in fact, choice and consequence has gotten worse. Jalendu Temple is our final dilemma. Once again, it centers on tradition versus progress, a repetition that has begun to damage its difficulty. If you gave Amita the poppy fields and the brick factory, allowing Karat to become a drug state for the sake of progress, or if you didn't, and you burn them down, it's unlikely you're going to change your philosophy now. There is an attempt to defer the nuance. Sabal will make Bardra Tarun Matara, but Amita will not. Personal stakes. Something more to think about, right? Yes, but barely. Bardra is a hollow character. She's been AWOL since the start of Act 2, and the 20 seconds she's got to fix that now fixes nothing. We know so little about who she is, what she wants, or how she feels. But most of all, we still don't even know what it means to be Tarun Matara. Is it a life of silence? Or does it mean she has to wear fancy dress and sit in a sacred chair from time to time? We don't know what's at stake or care. And while Bardra starves for screen time, Yogi, Reggie, and Longinus receive 8 separate cutscenes repeating themselves. Oh, I'm so glad you had the spare resources, Ubisoft. But the crucial problem with Act 3's Golden Path is Amita and Sabal themselves. Whoever it is you haven't been siding with, vanish from cutscenes and radio ever since the Brick Factory, and almost entirely, which ironically has a profound consequence, because we have only ever been told the consequences of our actions, only ever by Amita or Sabal, who warned you of potential consequences before you had made a decision and scorned you for those consequences afterwards. It was also this telling that made the choices tough, as their tireless arguments revealed a balance of complexities and dilemmas to the problem that you would never have considered otherwise. Now we are told nothing. What was the effect of destroying Jalendu, or of Bardra being made Tarun Matara? Why should we care? We can only guess, because Amita or Sabal were never there to bitch about it. Jalendu lacks impact. Our investment in the Golden Path weakens. It's a disappointment. Act 3 is driven by its high pace, strong setting, and excellent gameplay. These final hours are the high point of Far Cry 4. To that, the story's lacking is no threat, but they are denied a greater potential. Now, before we take Karat, one more person needs to die. Amita or Sabal. The vanished one has become too much of a problem, apparently, so you're sent to solve it for good. It is another frustrating symptom of their absence that you feel so little as you drive to the murder of someone who was once your accomplice. But when it comes to feeling, it's better late than never.
Did she send you, brother? Did you volunteer? What do you think you're doing?
I knew it'd come to this, would you?
Who else pulls the trigger around here?
Good point.
Far Cry 4 has always worked on the scene level, and this is no exception. It's one last reaction from a leader who knows they've lost everything, that all they feared will come to pass, and that you, RJ Gale, are the one who made it happen, and that you'll be their executioner. Their defeated rage is beautifully realized, and perhaps it's enough to make you unsure about what you're doing, perhaps for long enough to hesitate. The game quickly solidifies that hesitation into letting them walk away. Kill or don't, you're left standing with an effective sense of regret. Since the start of Act 3, there has been a tangible sense of uncertainty. With their growing power, whoever it is you've chosen has become cold and zealous. In Yuma's Crackden, there was a vision of the atrocities they may come to commit.
What are you asking, Nita?
I'm telling you to kill him. I'm being very particular with my words, Ajay.
I'm very particular with my words.
Particular words indeed. And in fact, Pagan Min is the second contributor of uncertainty to these final hours. I mean, it wouldn't be fucking Bardra now, would it? No. Since you left him at the beginning, Pagan has waged a much simpler war than ours. He has fought only the notion that a villain is what he ought to be. It's never mattered to him who you kill or what you take. He will call RJ nevertheless.
Uncle Pagan here, just checking in on my favorite nephew.
To catch up on twisted conversation or to offer twisted parental guidance.
It always hits you when it's too late, RJ. Always when they've gone.
But until now, in Act 3, we couldn't be sure what that really was. Maybe he never really believed he could lose. Maybe it was a mask or a strategy. But each time the stakes raise, the mask never slips, and we see further into the truth of Pagan's character.
Hello, RJ. Did you miss me? Oh, wait, yes, you did.
Pagan? I just killed you!
No, you just ruined a perfectly good body double with hair loss. Do you know how expensive he was to make? He wasn't even Asian, for Christ's sake.
He really doesn't care. Why? That palpable sense of doubt underlies the confident march you make with the Golden Path to assault Pagan's Gate. Wacky Indian pop backs one of the game's most boisterous fights. It's awesome, but there is an emptiness of truth to the conflict, of drama. The Royal Army fights harder than ever, but their king is more offended you blew up his sweet golden statue. At the foot of his palace, he jokingly asks if he should start taking all this personally.
Really, RJ? What do you have against my likeness?
You're fighting someone who isn't fighting back. You're fighting for someone who you doubt. And that uncertainty comes to a rising boil when you drive up to the palace. It is a moment no one who ever played this game could forget. The song is called The River by the Bombay Royale. It is incredible, a fusion of India and the cowboy west, so like Far Cry 4 in style that it sounds official. But like Far Cry 4 right now, it is a song where notes of triumph and pride drown in a damaged and regretful melody. It is the music of an empty victory. But the truth is, Far Cry 4 has been playing these notes in subtler ways and on the aesthetic level long before Act 3, ever since the game began. It has compared and juxtaposed the grand, meaningful thing that it once was, or that it should be, with the lesser, sadder, meaningless thing that exists in truth. Pagan Min, defined first and only as a shadow of the king he used to be, now an unhinged, simpering shell, unworthy even of his general. To Pagan, life these days is like a video game. His power is a tool for fun, and Kyrat is his playground. Kyrat is the perfect contrast to make its infestation of base human sin clear. It wouldn't need towering statues and sacred shrines to feel like a divine place, because it is secluded at the peak of the world, surrounded by mountains that inspire the awe of gods. So it speaks when we see those statues torn asunder, draped in armament, and wet with blood. When we see men fight and kill for sport, under the helpless gaze of their abandoned gods. Driven to the mountains by her king's weakness, Yuma and her army search the dead cities of Kalanag's mighty followers for the power of Shangri-La. She must be reborn, but only the ghost of the Rakshasa have come to haunt her terrible prison, because she, like them, seek paradise only to use it. Her men fruitlessly chip away at frozen tombs, and she lies broken in a nameless hole. You learn from Bardra, then Willis, that the legend of your father was a lie. He tried to have your mother killed. He was murdered in his own home. And then, what had only existed in the background becomes tangible, feelable in Act 3, as the Golden Path's heroism erodes in front of you, and Pagan continues to deny the story its villain, treating RJ as someone to be parented, viewing his victories as moments of pride instead of loss. He always did want you to stay and enjoy the crab rangoon. It was you who left the table, and that's exactly the image Far Cry 4 presents you with when the river reaches its end. RJ came to shoot Pagan in the head, and you were allowed to do so, but it doesn't feel right. It just doesn't. The game knows it, and hopes you'll stay your hand to see its true ending. This time, you sit, enjoy some food. The natural end to a fight you unnaturally forced into being at a table just like this one is not a bullet, but a conversation. One you really ought to hear.
I just want to hear you say it.
Fuck you.
My goodness, boy, you didn't even blink. Well, you do realize that you're just giving away your country, right? It's yours. It's always been yours. Kyrat is yours. I pulled you off the bus in the first place to pass it on to you. At least now we know you have a taste for doing what it takes. Well, no more putting it off, I suppose. Well, come on. And don't forget your mother. You do realize that urn represents all that's left of the old RJ. The pre-Kyrat RJ. Once you spread those ashes, all the ties you have to that previous life are gone. And then what happens? Well, I suppose you could do what I did after Mohan killed Lakshmana. Oh, you didn't know that, did you? Huh. Yes, your father killed your half-sister, and then your mother killed him in return. I simply continued where she left off. I killed so many people for them. But then I realized I was only using Lakshmana's death as an excuse to do whatever I wanted to do. Just as you use those ashes as an excuse to do whatever you want to do. God damn if it isn't fun. Well, you finally made it. You know, the one and only time I walked into this place, I came in a sane man and came out like this. You will come out a king.
That is one of my favorite endings to anything. I would not change a single moment, and I could not imagine anything else working in its place. Its beauty, its fucking mesmerizing style, and the character in every line of dialogue and every word of it spoken is just annoying, really. I'm frustrated, like with the intro, by my inability to further explain it. The secrets of Pagan's charisma are between Troy Baker and God, but I can tell you what it all amounts to. Pagan has completed Far Cry 4's demythologization. Your father was a monster, he slaughtered your sister, your mother killed him in return, and Pagan picked up where they left off. Not noble or legendary, base and terrible. But then he turns his gaze to RJ and reveals a truth we always knew but could never admit. It wasn't really about Lakshmana or spreading Ishwari's ashes. It wasn't about Karat or her future. It was about doing whatever the hell we wanted to do. Gods are turned to ash, legends are proven hollow, lies are exposed. Pagan deals the killing blow to his one true enemy, meaning, and demythologizes the game itself. When you're set free at the homestead, another song from the Bombay Royale is played, Guyara 59, a twinkling anxiety of a half-accepted horror that the cowboy's victory was no victory at all. You wallow for a minute in this contemplative depression, and what happens next is your reward. Just like the crack foretold, the golden path go bad. And they really fucking go bad, holy smokes. Sabal, a moralist who was once distraught at losing a handful of fighters, executes prisoners mercilessly, not for the sin of supporting Pagan, but for the sin of supporting Amita. And Amita has completely fucking lost her mind. Rounding up children to recruit into her army, threatening their parents with execution, talking to RJ like he's dirt. What the fuck happened? Did Top Man run out of puffer jackets? Was it all the Amita jokes? Well, I promised to stop. Because I'm gonna put you a meter in the ground. The theme demands a hollow victory, but it cannot justify such a change alone. Despite their rising cruelty throughout Act 3, there is a gaping chasm between who they were before the credits and who they are now. Don't forget, they can only be here to become evil if they were chosen to lead, if they got their way. Where's the setup? In a crack hallucination? And I haven't even told you the good part. As Amita leaves, RJ asks her what Bardra has to say about this. She says it doesn't matter. Bardra was sent away, and not to bother looking, because she is never coming back. Dumb puffer jacket bitch say, what? She iced Bardra? Maybe a living Tarun Matara for Amita's religious foes to rally behind was a serious problem. The Amita we knew would never have killed Bardra despite that problem. She shielded her from Sabal and the expectations of symbolhood. She taught her the bow, independence, and now she's had her whacked? It's forced for the sake of the theme. It's undercooked, like everything involving this pair of Muppets since Act 3 began. And that is the last thing that happens in Far Cry 4. Which leaves us with a final question. Far Cry 4 is an anti-myth. But why? What is the meaning of the meaninglessness? Guyara 59 made me depressed, but what was that to say? There are two answers that matter. The first is what I believe to be the truth. Far Cry 4 is a critique of gamification.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because he's a tin pot dictator. You know, he's a peacock. He wants power. He's after his own self-interest. But strangely enough, if you think about the player in a lot of Far Cry games, so are they. You know what I mean? They are imposing themselves in the environment. They are, you know, stopping a murderer by murdering people. There's a lot of similarities between the player and the villains, to be honest, in most Far Cry games. And so having him talk about that and having him assess that and challenge the player on why they're there and what they want to do felt like an interesting way to have the player question their own motivation.
It is another reflection of Far Cry 3 in this sense, where Jason's descent into madness mirrored the player's growth in skill, where Vast showed us what the player could become, and Rook Island's nonsensical, never-ending barbarity represented the game world. Compared to Karat, Rook was completely sane, but compared to Vast, Pagan takes a more direct approach. He doesn't seem to represent what the player could become, but instead, what the player truly is underneath. In every way, we are detached from relation or responsibility to Karat by our knowledge that it is just a video game. Pagan mirrors a similar degree of separation in his complete disconnection from group identity, from higher power, from Karat itself, and thus from morality and responsibility to anything but himself. He might as well have come from a different dimension, just like we did. And that, as for us, allows him to see Karat as a playground. He mirrors our power as players in his kingship, and our impulsive, wicked whimsy in his own. He mirrors our vanity, our need for material possession and for social standing. And in his one stated goal, he mirrors our motive, to have fun.
Maybe now we can finally shoot some goddamn guns.
We and Pagan share as visible a symmetry as Jason and Vast, but the key of it all is the one difference we do have. We don't admit it. We need to lie, to dress up our motive and convince ourselves that we serve a higher, purer purpose than that of our own fun. We want to believe we're a hero, and that lie, of all the meaning Far Cry 4 doggedly undermines, is the focus of its attack. Throughout the game, Pagan spends what seems like all of his time trying to relate to RJ on the base level of the player, your instincts, your vanity, your violence, completely dismissing the notion of heroism or the sincerity of your part in the Golden Path's rebellion. Paul, Pagan's right-hand psychopath, similarly sees a darker truth inside RJ that he just can't admit. Specific attention is drawn to the symbol of the dinner table, where you chose to ignore Pagan's instructions and start throwing your shit around with all the other monkeys. The message is in the tragedy that follows. You can't save the world by doing what you want to it. Indulging every murderous whim doesn't make you a hero, and it doesn't get you the good ending. But here's the thing. Ask about what Far Cry 4 meant, and the second, common answer doesn't sound anything like that. It doesn't even sound thematic. It's that Pagan was the real good guy, the Golden Path were the real bad guys, and the emotional tone of the ending was merely an expression of this simple plot point. And that's despite the Far Cry franchise being known for introspection, despite Far Cry 4 being a sequel to Far Cry 3, and despite Far Cry 4's aesthetic trends. Why then is the second answer the common answer? Why is it almost impossible from a first playthrough to take its message away? And why is Far Cry 4 not looked upon like Far Cry 3? The answer is simple. Far Cry 4 fails to clearly and convincingly link its tragic end to the subject of its critique. It begins with the protagonist. Because Jason Brody's path to darkness mirrored the player's growth in skill, the connection between the game and darkness was reasonably apparent. Far Cry 4 doesn't do this or anything like this. RJ is a kind, calm, moral person, a boring person in truth, and he remains this way from the beginning of the game to the end, despite the half-acknowledged superhuman competence for bloodshed he so quickly develops. Losing Far Cry 3's connection of protagonist and theme puts Far Cry 4 at a major disadvantage. Now, 4's angle on gamification is slightly different than 3's, where that game said, look at what this world has done to you. Far Cry 4 is more, look at what your pursuit of self-satisfaction has perpetuated. It does this with the dinner table. It does this by relating you to Pagan.
At our first meeting, you sat right here. Paul was off applying voltage to the nipples of your rude little +1. I stood just like this, and what were my exact words? Stay here, enjoy the crab rangoon, don't move, I'll be right back.
And so what it needs is to make us feel responsible. The emotion, in specific, is guilt. But we don't feel responsible. We feel no guilt. And the reasons why begin with RJ. You see, RJ wants to kill Pagan Min. Really, really bad. Twice he throws himself at an opportunity, bursting out the door in pursuit of his body double at Utkarsh, and then leaving the Golden Path at the palace to fight the reinforcements alone, because, and I quote,
I'm going after Pagan.
Perhaps you're wondering what could possibly explain such a hateful impulse from a character who is otherwise extremely calm and controlled, towards a character who hasn't given RJ much reason to hate him. Yeah, I'm wondering that too. Is it meant to represent the player's bloodthirsty urges? A last-ditch attempt to connecting the two of us? It doesn't read that way if so, because it actively conflicts with how the player feels. While our uncertainty comes to the forefront as we drive up that hill, RJ's resolve is stronger than ever. His baffling lust for Pagan's blood reads as an independent characteristic, which severely damages the game's focus on the player, as the ending accuses of violent, selfish whims. It was RJ who just barreled up a hill and spoke only once to say this.
Fuck you.
Do you see how easy it would be for the first-time player not to see themselves in the spotlight, or to see RJ Gale as the problem instead? But when it comes to guilt, there are bigger problems than RJ Gale. I've spoken so far as if the game's belief that you chose to be a violent psycho had any legitimacy, as if the dinner table that symbolizes your original sin was an airtight accusation, but it isn't. We didn't leave that room because we just wanted to shoot things. We left it because we assumed we had to. And what's more, we didn't really want to. Who wanted to leave Pagan for the Golden Path? Whoever believed they'd make for a better time? Was there a single moment where, given the choice, we abandoned what's just for what's fun? There wasn't, and so Far Cry 4's war on meaning goes a step too far, undermining even itself. Or at least, most of itself. The game might not be immediately intelligible or right, but there is some truth to Far Cry 4's ideas that is not impossible to see upon reflection. We do want to be called heroes, even when we're not. We are at a moral distance from the game, and that does make us more like the Psycho King than we'd like to believe. Far Cry 4 overshoots and highlights this truth in all the wrong ways, but maybe it does enough to get you thinking about it. Maybe you can take something away. Maybe then its failure is not absolute. It wasn't for me. Do you know I've played this game 10 times? A lot of my favorite games are like that. I hope to find something rational to justify how much I love them, but usually I can't. They're flawed, and I still love them for something immaterial and unprovable. Far Cry 4's ending works for me because it's beautiful. Inside and out, in every way, it's just beautiful. And so when I think about these ideas, it's not to the better argument or to the smarter game. I remember the man in the pink suit, hollowed out by grief, and the glistening mountains he took for himself, and the finger he pointed at me. I remember the river and Gaiara 59 and the clash, and that's what gets me thinking about what I know the ending tried to say. The game has such a fashion sense, such a style. The setting, the contrasts, the colors, the songs, even those Quentin Tarantino stylizations that seem to work so well. Where else can you get a soul like this one? So here I am, back on the bus for the 11th time, to prove Pagan half right again. Maybe I'm not a hero, but god damn if it isn't fun. And you know what? God damn if this game isn't so much more than a reskin of its predecessor. That I have proven, and that's enough for me. Thank you for watching. Special thanks go out to Brybase, Chase Baker, Chino, Dr. Pavel, Eli Weaver, G Series, I Hear You, Istura, John C, John Lemley, Caleb Doss, Lex Williams, L Hudson, MT the Poet, Newts, Storyteller Max, Save, The Wayfinder 12, William Vossler, Warthol, Andre Baltuta, Anton, Attila, Bloth, Blue Eyes White Idiot, Bozian, Brandon Harris, Caleb Finnemore, Calvin Black, Colby the Ranchman, Combat Wombat, Connor Fraser, Corey Walterbeek, Dan Walker, Deluxo, DJ, Dominic Jaworski, Eric Marhal, Ethan Seach, Floyd Dibben, George Garegian, Hannes Norriger, Hidibari, Hypocrite, Holy Shift. I joined Tier 3 because I wanted to hear Whitelight say this out loud. I pay my cam girl, so why not you? Jacob Bartels, Joe Simmons, Joshua W. Schreiner, Casper Schmidt, Louis Burney, Malone Patron, Milo W, Monochrome Only, Nachos Brohim, Nathan, Navy Husky, Princess Zed, Wreckin' Hawk, Rollo Runner, Sad Cabbage, Shade, The Last Great Opium Den, Trending Tech, V, Vertigious, and Voy.